Why Keir Starmer? That's the question that's plagued my mind as the election approaches. This man is almost certain to become the next Prime Minister of the UK, and I can't shake the question, why? The British public, at least if the polling is to be believed, are about to hand Keir Starmer a huge majority in Parliament. The kind of majority and mandate that means you could basically do whatever you wanted. Insofar as Britain has a constitutional arrangement, it's best summarised as long as you have a majority in Parliament, you can more or less do as you please. You want to send Mr. Blobby to the moon? You can do that. Want to ban people from eating bounty bars? Well, as long as you've got that majority for it. Want to nationalise Greggs? Go right ahead. The point is that whoever commands a majority in the Commons, they get to become Prime Minister. And the position of Prime Minister affords you a lot of influence and a lot of power. That's why this video, unlike the last video in this series that I did, focuses on an individual more than on an institution. Unless you live in Wales, Labour haven't really meaningfully been in power as an institution over the past 14 years. If they do come back into office at the UK level, they'll be led by, and therefore investing a lot of power into, Keir Starmer. A man who has a carefully cultivated public image and reputation. That public image that his supporters and he apparently have wanted to cultivate contains some of these elements, and it somewhat depends on who you ask. Competence. That he's not corrupt. He's a grown-up. He's secretly a radical if you just give him a chance. He can transform organizations with his mere presence. He's a human rights lawyer, so therefore is good. It's just a shame that this cultivated image is a lie. Or to be more precise, there's very little evidence that if these things were ever true, that he's retained the essential parts of these traits up to now. The truth is that Keir Starmer is still kind of a mystery. And you might be thinking, how can a video about what might well be the most boring man in Britain possibly be this long? It's because while he is undoubtedly a boring, white, 61-year-old guy, he's had a long and prestigious career that's left a mark on the public record. You don't get to be a sir for nothing. And while he might be cagey about who he really is in interviews, we can get to know who the real Keir Starmer is if we just look in the right places both before and during his parliamentary career. He's disguised or cleverly tried to worm his way out of so many things that I thought, let's make a resource for everyone to refer to with as many of the various acts he's committed in one place as possible. This won't be exhaustive since, you know, I have to put a limit on the scope of a YouTube video because otherwise this video would have got even more out of hand. And I'm sure that people will be delighted to fill in any gaps I left in the comments section. Make no mistake though, this man is a lot more than meets the eye. I can say with some certainty that he would be one of the most dangerous prime ministers that the UK has ever had. And I don't mean that in the way the Conservatives say it about like every single Labour leader. This guy is quite something. Some of you will be jumping onto your keyboards to say, oh, so you want the Tories to win? Do you think they're good? And to you, I'd say, check out my first video in this series, which is about the Tories. You might be surprised by how terrible I think they are. And when I came to that opinion, because my suspicion is a lot of the most fanatical Keir Starmer supporters came to the opinion the Conservatives were bad a little bit more recently than they would care to admit. What I want to do here is to make sure that if you are going to vote for a Labour candidate, you do so with your eyes open about who your preferred candidate will support to become Prime Minister, and to understand that this is how he and the people around him have behaved before they got their hands onto state power. After all, power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. So let's see what Keir Starmer has revealed about himself with the power that he's held. I want to pivot then from why to who. Who is Keir Starmer? And does he deserve to become Prime Minister with the kinds of majorities that have been predicted for him, or even at all? Before we get into the video, just because this is a really long one, probably my longest video ever, I just want to say, if you're enjoying the video so far, if you like the topic, if you're coming back to the channel and haven't subscribed before, just drop a subscription. We are super close at the time of recording to the 2,000 subscriber goal I set for the end of the year. So, you know, just help me get over the line. We're really close. Let's make it happen. But with that, let's get into Keir Starmer and all of the horrible things he's said and done. Keir Starmer loves telling us about what he did before Parliament and what his upbringing was like. I bet if you're British, you know what Keir Starmer's dad did for a living. If you don't, I'll let Keir Starmer himself enlighten you.
My dad worked in a factory. He was a tool maker.
I saw this with my dad. He was a tool maker.
I grew up in a Pebble Dash semi. My dad was a tool maker and worked in a factory all his life.
My dad was a tool maker.
His mum also worked in the NHS as a nurse. He mentions that less often, but it's still also seared into my brain. I'm gonna be honest here. I don't really care about someone's upbringing too much. Whether your dad was a tool maker or an aristocrat, you can have good political positions. The good and bad type of class traitor exist. So why does Keir Starmer bring it up then? One, he's trying to give his personal life a kind of rags to riches style narrative. This isn't wholly unreasonable. Lots of politicians try to build their legend, and the #1 rule of politics is if you've got 'em, smoke 'em. Keir Starmer isn't the first, and he won't be the last politician to give himself a narrative to play to. The second reason is, I think he's trying to appear more relatable and authentic. Some might call this being an authentocrat. This has just been the mode of doing politics by people who seem to be afraid of having actual politics. The most notorious example of this is Jess Phillips, who affects as if she has a working class background when that seems debatable upon inspection. Living in a household where both your parents work, they struggle, they fret about bills, and they do all this really difficult stuff is something I relate to, certainly. I'm sure that more than a few of you have your own experiences that are similar. It's a really effective tool, and the way Keir Starmer specifically does it is sleight of hand. First, he primarily talks about his dad. His mum sometimes gets mentioned, but it's mostly his dad, not his grandparents. Not that I particularly cared that his granddad was apparently a gamekeeper who lived in a castle. It's just interesting where hereditary class signifiers begin and end. Wouldn't it be inconvenient if there were suspicions that Keir Starmer's dad wasn't just a humble tool maker, but actually owned the tool factory? There's been speculation along this line. According to Lord Ashcroft, Rodney Starmer owned his own business, the Oxted Tool Company, and appears to have operated it as a sole trader. I went looking for myself on Companies House to see if there were any records, and the only record for Rodney Starmer, the toolmaker, was being director for the Donkey Breed Society, which is a niche thing to be a director of, but I suppose someone has to do it. I want to put two statements to you about Keir Starmer's dad that could be true at the same time. Keir Starmer's dad was a tool maker, and Keir Starmer's dad owned the tool factory. Both of these statements can be true. Your local boss man at the kebab shop could both work in the kebab shop and own it. You can be active in a business that you own and have employees at it. It just doesn't read as authentically working class, does it? I suppose we might let this slide. Whatever his mum and dad did, that's on them. What they did is neither to his credit or his detriment. As I said earlier, his specific upbringing, which to me looks rather more comfortable than he likes to let on, doesn't really matter. What does matter is that he's clearly trying to present specific aspects of it to us, and we have to determine whether this is just reasonable politicking within the bounds of what we'd expect, or if it fits into a broader pattern of half-truths and misdirection. I'd also say that no matter what your background is, if you're a 61-year-old knight of the realm who's been a well-regarded human rights lawyer, the director of public prosecutions, an MP, a shadow cabinet member, and leader of one of the two major political parties in the UK, and in all likelihood will become Prime Minister, there's some chance your upbringing is less relevant than you might like to the question of how suitable are you to lead this country. I would argue that you've left whatever working class roots you may have had behind at this point. Either way, enough about this guy's parents. There will be plenty of opportunities for Keir Starmer to tell us what his dad did over the next few weeks of the election. Let's focus on his main career and what he got up to when he was a lawyer. Keir Starmer is often lauded by his supporters as being a human rights lawyer, and by virtue of that experience, which he himself often cites, he's going to be a good Prime Minister for those of us who are less powerful in society. Now, there is an unflattering comparison you could make. The far-right leader in France, Marine Le Pen, was also a lawyer, a public defender. Is she going to be good for people in France when she probably wins the French snap election? I don't know. Look, I'm just pointing out that there's a flaw in the logic. The further point is that by virtue of this experience, he will be, in effect, an advocate for us all, which is a nice and appealing thought. But in the context of more recent comments he's made, I maybe wouldn't want an advocate of that sort. Part of this appeal is clearly that there's a section of press opinion that views a lawyer as a legitimate authority. You know, they know the law. If they advocate on behalf of people who are vulnerable to human rights abuses, then they're using that knowledge for good, and therefore they're good. They can only be good. He even has some interesting credentials in that regard. He was a member of and secretary for the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. That makes him sound pretty legit, at least in his youth. He was the secretary for a radical group of lawyers and was a member of the group until he became director of public prosecutions in 2008. But there were already some signs of the man he'd become. To quote Oliver Eagleton's book, The Starmer Project, in their view, Starmer's aim was to weaken the Haldane's links with communist groups such as the International Association of Democratic Lawyers and refashion it as a human rights-ist institution with a high media profile. His peers rebuked him when he suggested excising socialism from the society's name and replacing it with progressive or democratic. This speaks to a particularly liberal instinct at his core. Generally speaking, I think it's very suspect to be in an explicitly socialist group and try to make the word socialism a taboo. It's not that the language we use doesn't matter. There was a lot of this going on at the time Starmer was doing this, and there's nothing wrong with the word democratic, you know, just to be clear about it. But I want to be very clear before I tell you this next part. I am not making an equivalence here, but this did remind me of the ex-BNP leader, Nick Griffin, when he was on a trip to America to meet with American friends of the BNP, which included David Duke, and just sounds like the worst group of people who could exist in the world. When he said at this meeting, the BNP isn't about selling out its ideas, but we are determined to sell them. Basically, that means use saleable words such as freedom, identity, security, democracy. Again, I want to be very clear here. I am not making an equivalence either between Keir Starmer and Nick Griffin, or socialism and the scientific racism that the BNP believes in. However, this betrays that Keir Starmer, even in his more radical days, is falling into the trap of thinking like a right-winger or a liberal. To disguise your politics with palatable words when you consider them unpalatable, and to fundamentally be dishonest. It's also stupid. The reason the right imitates the rhetoric of the left is because our rhetoric is popular and effective. I'll keep banging that drum for as long as we need to hear it. In the long run, if you want to resist fascism and their allies across the right, you need to think like a socialist and not like a fascist or a liberal. This is a test the young Keir Starmer was already struggling with a little bit. All that being said, If his record as a human rights lawyer is so strong, then even if he's stumbling and struggling to think like a radical or a socialist, maybe we should judge him, as he constantly requests, by his actions in this time and not his words, or the observations of his peers. Well, let's look at some examples that I think will show us the direction he moved in through his career. The McLibel case was a libel case, shockingly, in England, which currently has, and has pretty much always had, some pretty rotten defamation laws. I made a video about those defamation laws, you should go check it out. But in a surprise twist, the McLibel case was brought by McDonald's, one of the most recognizable brands, richest and most powerful companies in the world at the time and now. The case was brought against two London Greenpeace group activists because of a leaflet they'd made called "What's Wrong with McDonald's? Everything They Don't Want You to Know," which accused the corporation of encouraging litter, mistreating animals and workers, and destroying rainforests. So of course, the big evil corporation is mad that people are saying things about them that make them look, you know, like a big evil corporation. So they take the activists to court. 3 of these activists apologized, 2 of them held firm and became the McLibel 2, which is just a great sort of nickname to have. They couldn't afford legal representation at the time, and there was no legal aid available, leaving them to defend themselves and hope that some kind-hearted lawyers would work with them pro bono. In steps Keir Starmer, who actually did occasionally lend a hand to represent the McLibel too, and featured in the documentary about the case made by Franny Armstrong and Ken Loach. Boy, wouldn't it be awkward if Keir Starmer went on to punish people for hanging out with Ken Loach? So that's where all this rather nice footage of a younger looking Keir Starmer comes from, the documentary and the interviews he gave. He continued to provide his services up to the European Court of Human Rights, and successfully argued the McLibel 2's human rights had been violated by the lack of provision of legal aid, which was why he represented them in the first place. This is actually a really interesting part of Keir Starmer's career, firstly because this was, and I think still is, the longest libel case in English history, secondly because it demonstrates an instinct that I think is unfamiliar to the Keir Starmer we see today, to provide your services for free to people who are otherwise unable to afford it, who are facing one of the most powerful corporations in the world. It's a fundamentally very decent thing to do. And I do kind of wonder if his experience doing this taught him that no good deed goes unpunished, given what he went on to do. And I really want to give Starmer the benefit of the doubt here and just say he really believed in the cause, and the notoriety that would come from this wasn't part of his thinking at all. But now, I just want to say that whether Starmer believed in the cause or not, he still did something that was very generous and demonstrated skill in his chosen field. It's just such a contrast with so much of the instinct he would demonstrate in other cases. Let's take a trip together to the sleepy southern English hamlet of Firle. This is the point where I need to explain to our non-British viewers something about Britain. Certain kinds of places, usually rural, they're full of people who for like 98% of the time are completely fine. It's just that these places also tend to be somewhere where older traditions continue to be practiced more frequently than they would, you know, in a place like where I live, the center of a diverse city. Some of these traditions are essentially fine, and are just a little odd, as long as they don't do blackface during them, which yes, does still happen sometimes. Some of them are a little unnerving, and some have the potential to be extremely racist when placed in specific context. This is one of those moments, and I will turn to a description from Oliver Eagleton's The Starmer Project for this quote. But before we get into the quote, I do want to just add additional context here to say that this, what I'm about to read to you, takes place during a campaign against the traveller community that included arson attacks. On the 25th of October 2003, residents of the southern English hamlet of Firle gathered for the centuries-old festivity that has made their area famous, a torchlit procession and bonfire replete with occultic costumes and folk dancing. The ritual is usually themed around an issue that has troubled the local community over the past year, So on this occasion, the Forde Bonfire Society decided to address the creation of a nearby traveller encampment. They commandeered a caravan, slapped on a number plate that read P1KEY, and wheeled it through the streets while playing wooden fifes and brandishing burning crosses. When they reached a field outside the village, effigies of traveller children were placed inside the vehicle and it was set alight to cheers from local onlookers. This is a pretty striking incident, and it's incredibly obvious that some kind of incitement to hatred or a hate crime has happened here with the context I provided. The crowd in attendance was also encouraged to chant, "Burn it, burn it," and the best denial they could find was the classic British reaction to being called racist, which is to claim that your racism is in fact evidence that you're not racist, which is a hell of a logical leap to ask people to make, but I guess that's probably the best they could hope for given the circumstances. It's pretty clear that there is a human rights issue at play here, namely the right of the traveller community to exist without being harassed or having hatred incited against them. The Director of Public Prosecution at the time, who wanted to charge the organisers with incitement to racial hatred, in light of that, handpicked the perfect human rights lawyer to recommend action on this case. Can you guess who it is yet? Here's the advice that Keir Starmer gave to the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time that he followed according to Eagleton's book. The advice stated unequivocally that the organisers should not be prosecuted. Starmer argued that their actions were not intended to stoke prejudice, nor serious enough to merit legal sanction, and called for the charges to be scrapped. Given the context, I don't really understand how you could draw the conclusion that this wasn't intended to stoke prejudice. I get that some traditions are like a couple of steps behind where we'd like them to be, and that they have to evolve. But this was clear racial incitement, and Keir Starmer, for whatever reason, just couldn't see it. He was either unwilling or incapable, and given that we know he is a capable lawyer, or so his supporters keep telling us, and the McLibel case I think demonstrates, this reads to me as unwilling. What that says about him at this time, I'm not entirely sure, because frankly, it is astonishing. While I haven't checked that this was the first case he'd given a recommendation about regarding racism, given the body of work we're about to dive into, it does look like you could place it at the start of a slide where he defers to the politically dominant racial group's desire to express racism rather than the victims of racism. Hardly the champion of the vulnerable. Something else Keir Starmer loves to talk about is his work in Northern Ireland. Given how much of an achievement it was, however temporarily, let's sort of fingers crossed on that one, the situation there, a lot of politicians have sought to borrow the glory of it. Labour in particular cite the Good Friday Agreement as one of their great achievements in office. What was Keir Starmer up to? Originally, he was on a fact-finding mission about police brutality, which was definitely happening. Ever the centrist, he represented members of the IRA who were mistreated by British prison officers, while also representing Lee Clegg, a British private who shot into a vehicle killing a passenger. That particular case would eventually come to a retrial, and Starmer would demonstrate some of that lawyerly ability again and get him cleared of murder. It's decidedly a mixed bag, but I would say the decision to represent a British soldier, in my view, occupying a country he has no business being in and killing civilians is a strong signal. Yes, he'll protect people from being beaten and humiliated in prisons, but he's in favour of prisons, just not for British soldiers. He was also appointed to the Northern Irish Police Board, where he would simultaneously condone the police brutality committed by the police service of Northern Ireland, and even rejected the idea of an explicit ban on the use of tasers and plastic bullets on children, which, given his later opinions about state violence towards children, kind of tracks. What I think we see in Starmer's rise as a lawyer is a character who charts a deliberate course. Yes, there are examples of things that I think are really good. You know, representing the McLibel too, his work on the death penalty, even if it's not really opposition to the death penalty itself, but more to the way the death penalty was handed out as a punishment. These were good things. Yet we also see deference to power and to dominant power structures, the power of white supremacy and racism in the case of Forde, which, make no mistake, was and is a powerful force in the UK, and the power of the UK security establishment. This made him kind of an oxymoron, simultaneously possessing radical credentials, but also curiously a safe person for the political establishment. Kind of a perfect Trojan horse, if you will. Keir Starmer was appointed Director of Public Prosecutions, which is a role in the UK that involves essentially being the chief cop. If you're Director of Public Prosecutions, you're in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service, which is the body that handles criminal prosecutions in England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland are different, but don't worry about that too much for now. The political arrangement with the role is that the Director of Public Prosecution is appointed by the Attorney General and reports to them. And there are independent panels that recommend who should be appointed, but ultimately the Attorney General makes the decision and is held accountable for what the DPP does in Parliament, even though nominally they have no influence over the Director of Public Prosecutions or the Crown Prosecution Service, since it's supposed to be independent of the government. Even though this arrangement to me makes it kind of obvious that there is an incentive to try and interfere and meddle, and you might find this a bit difficult to take, since the implication of this arrangement is that in order to be appointed you have to be, if not personally close or necessarily politically close to the Attorney General. I think you'd at least have to be seen as a safe pair of hands by them in terms of protecting the state interest. Regardless, he was appointed and loves to brag about how he changed the organization, including how many people he prosecuted. Now, I'm not the audience for this. I'm opposed to the carceral state. But I can see a twisted logic in putting it front and center. One anecdote he's fond of telling, in fact he did it during the first debate of the election, is one where he apparently prosecuted some terrorists so hard they were forced to land the planes they were hijacking. Okay, that's not really what he did or what happened, but he makes it sound like that. When Keir Starmer talks about his time as Director of Public Prosecutions, the stories have a familiar pattern. He only talks about his successes under the entirely fictional framework that the carceral state can ever succeed. And he only offers a vague managerial, if the organization failed on my watch, the buck stops with me style of taking responsibility for failings. It's a familiar story. Every success is about my personal greatness, but every failure is structural and institutional, and what could I really do about it? The thing is, this runs counter to one of the key aspects Starmer and his supporters love to tout. You'll hear Starmer talk about my changed Labour Party, which is a pretty grotesque thing to say, partially for reasons that we will get into later. But to him and his supporters, I simply ask this. Is Keir Starmer a person capable of single-handedly changing institutions with his leadership, or is he a person to whom things happen without him being aware to the extent that he can't possibly be held responsible for them? You can't have your cake and eat it. With that, I want to explore some of the controversies from his time as Director of Public Prosecutions that he has various levels of blame for, and to kick us off, I'll hand over to a friend of the channel and former subject of one of the videos I've done to introduce us to this huge and important topic.
This is the legendary Jimmy Savile.
The earliest accusation by a politician in the House of Commons that Keir Starmer had failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile, an accusation that had been circulating online for quite a while before this, was in Boris Johnson's response to the Sue Gray report. Yes, that's Sue Gray, who now works for Starmer. He said the following according to Hansard. Instead, this leader of the opposition, a former Director of Public Prosecutions, although he spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile. It's fitting then that the first, at least the first that I could find, article of the general election making use of this claim was also by Boris Johnson. In his article in the Daily Mail, which is largely made up of incoherent culture war shite, he says, he always brags about his time as head of the Crown Prosecution Service, and how he takes responsibility for everything that took place on his watch, except of course for the failure to prosecute Jimmy Savile, just as they say, saying. People treat this point as a taboo, an unmentionable, but let's face it, if others had that kind of failure on their CV, a Tory for instance, it would be thought at least worthy of comment. Which I think tells you how serious this actually is in the case presented by Boris Johnson. Normally I'd dismiss this out of hand and say, this is a right-wing smear job, and we just leave it there. So why am I entertaining this? 3 reasons. It's a topic that will come up again in this election. I've seen it being repeated on social media websites, and so it's worth addressing in detail. 2. Keir Starmer himself has said the buck stops with him for things that went wrong, and has said that when the government has had one of its many failures, that the buck stops with the Prime Minister. We should take Keir Starmer seriously, as hard as that may be, and see whether the buck should indeed stop with him. 3. Boris Johnson is kind of right about one thing. If a Tory was the head of the organisation that had failed to prosecute someone like Jimmy Savile, the same people who are absolving Keir Starmer of any responsibility would never shut the fuck up about it. I would never shut the fuck up about it. Therefore, I feel obligated to some extent to at least examine the merit of what the accusation is in detail. What is the specific accusation? If you read Boris Johnson's words, I think it's clear that he believes that Keir Starmer is personally responsible and had a hand in the decision not to prosecute Jimmy Savile. This is going to shock you all, I know, but I don't think Boris Johnson is accurately reporting the facts here. There isn't, or at least I haven't found, any compelling evidence that Keir Starmer was directly involved in the decision to close the case against Jimmy Savile. That decision was undertaken by someone junior to him without his knowledge. For whatever reason, the Crown Prosecution Service at the time appeared to have no mechanism for potentially high-profile cases with significant public interest, given that Savile was, after all, friends with the royals and senior Tories, to be moved up the chain so that the most senior prosecutor available could review the decision. That is a textbook institutional failure, and smarter people understand this. So the accusation often moves to Keir Starmer led an organisation that failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile, which I'm afraid is technically correct, the best kind of correct. Keir Starmer cannot at once claim every good decision is his, while every failure is the institution's, especially not when he touts how he changes or professionalizes organizations. To allow him this would be to make him out to be the world's most unlucky prosecutor, which I find difficult to believe. He was in charge of the Crown Prosecution Service when it failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile, and his response when the allegations were put to his spokesperson didn't exactly seem like he was on the ball about how he should respond. Keir Starmer made it his mission as Director of Public Prosecution to ensure that victims of crime received justice and that criminals were brought to book for their crimes. He is rightly proud of his record. Yeah, I bet that's a comfort to Jimmy Savile's victims. And I get it. It's an uncontroversial media response, but it doesn't address any specifics. And I think there's a reason for that. While we don't know what would have happened if the case had been sent up to him at the time, I do want to mention that there's an interesting part of this Guardian article. He later reviewed the case in 2012 and came very close to rubber stamping the original decision not to prosecute, before deciding at the last minute to commission his chief legal advisor, Alison Levitt, to conduct a formal inquiry. Now, this does not mean that Keir Starmer would 100% have agreed with the decision if it had reached his desk in 2009 when the case was closed. That being said, I do think it's interesting that his initial instinct was to agree with the decision, at least according to the reporting. To his credit, he stopped and got his advisor to conduct an inquiry, which is better than rubber stamping the decision, but an inquiry in Britain is traditionally a big delaying exercise that tends to result in a conclusion that's something like, lessons were learned, and who can say who is to blame? Big shrug, and we just sort of move on. And people are expected to move on from the story just like that. In this case, we're somewhat forced to because the Crown Prosecution Service records relating to the case were destroyed, which is great, I guess. Look, I work at a job where I get audited reasonably often. Just to sort of talk about the records being destroyed there, it's just kind of astonishing to me. But it's perhaps a sign that if he wasn't captured by the interests of toadying to power before, that he was by this point. That this seemed to pass unremarked on by him. That no one in the organization found this curious speaks to either him adopting the characteristics of the institution or his failure to meaningfully change the Crown Prosecution Service. You might argue, not unreasonably, that the Crown Prosecution Service is a huge organization and change would take time. And you know what else is a huge organization? The Labour Party. And he's been claiming that he's changed it or will change the things that need changing since day one. Really, I don't think there's a lot to come from focusing on this aspect of his record. It won't stop some people, and the truth is that hearing the words Keir Starmer and Jimmy Savile in sentences together might well do the job that Boris Johnson wants it to. That may not be fair, but I guess Starmer should have led an organisation that prosecuted Jimmy Savile. Sucks to suck. In all seriousness, there are aspects of his record as Director of Public Prosecutions that are much more worthy of attention and discussion, that demonstrates more clearly some of the instincts he'd learned earlier in his career and would carry until now. On the issue of prosecuting people, it's interesting who the Crown Prosecution Service under his watch decided to subject to their force and who they decided not to. Let's transport ourselves back to August 2011. I'm 17, getting ready for my final year of school, have just discovered to my shock that having a personality beyond enjoying sports and video games and sports-based video games is both rewarding and makes you a more appealing person to be friends with. Something else that was happening at the time was the police shooting of Mark Duggan, which resulted in peaceful marches followed by rioting. While there's a lot of debate as to the cause of the riots, that's incidental to the purpose of the video. And what we're really interested in is in how Keir Starmer, as Director of Public Prosecutions, reacted to this, and contrast it a little bit with two interesting cases that I think speak to what his priorities were, or how willing he was to bend to the priorities of the British state rather than any meaningful sense of justice. In response to the riots, Keir Starmer ran all-night courts, which is exactly what it sounds like, in order to rapidly prosecute anyone arrested for riot-related activities. As you might imagine, rapid prosecutions in all-night courts may not have been the environment where proportionate decisions were made, and this farce included Starmer making a morale-boosting visit to magistrates at 4 AM. Gee, if only Keir Starmer knew someone who was in charge and could improve morale by not making people work at 4 AM. Oh well! There's a particular example in the circles that I move in that is brought up a lot when it comes to Keir Starmer. The extremely exciting case of the Lidl water thief. It's hardly Watergate, is it? Nicholas Robinson, a guy with no previous criminal record, was walking home during the riots and went into Lidl and grabbed a packet of bottled water. We can make arguments about whether all-night courts were needed to process the sheer number of people, but no matter the circumstances, this would probably have resulted in a very minor penalty under normal circumstances. What penalty did he get? Well, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison, according to the Journal. In handing down the sentence, the judge said that he was taking 23-year-old Robinson's previous good character and early guilty plea into consideration, but also said that the students willfully contributed towards the atmosphere of both chaos and sheer lawlessness, which is a pretty fucking astonishing thing to say. What would the penalty have been if he didn't have previous good character? Don't you think that in the context of a series of riots, there may be more significant things that happened? I don't want to engage in hyperbole, but the capital city of a major European country had parts of it ablaze, and the main focus seems to have been on petty theft. People stealing water, TVs, and bringing children, some of them aged 11, to have the full force of the prosecutorial wing of the British state brought upon them. Think of how that contrasts with a couple of other decisions. First, his decision not to reverse his predecessor's awful ruling where he didn't prosecute the killers of John Charles de Menezes, a Brazilian man who was racially profiled and then shot 7 times in the head by members of the Met Police. His decision not to reverse his predecessor's decision, based on his predecessor's uncritical acceptance of the police narrative, was despite the fact that this narrative was rejected by a jury at an inquest. The official claim of a lawful killing was not consistent with the new evidence that had emerged, yet Starmer spared the officers responsible from the full force of the British state's prosecution. The other is the case of Ian Tomlinson, a newspaper vendor trying to avoid the protests at that year's G20 summit, who was randomly attacked by a policeman with a baton and pushed to the ground. The resulting internal bleeding meant that he would go on to die. Keir Starmer made the decision that he would not be prosecuted with the justification that there was insufficient evidence. Starmer was eventually forced to reverse the decision, but the officer was found not guilty. The fact that in one case, Starmer just brushed off the idea of revising a decision that appeared to be clearly wrong and based on bad information, and in the other had to have his arm twisted, does not reflect well on his conduct as Director of Public Prosecutions. It's not a coincidence that during his career as Director of Public Prosecutions, that he not only acquiesced to the preferences of the British political establishment, in both going soft on police officers and coming down hard on rioters who stole bottles of water. To me, it's foundational. A good example is his handling of the Spy Cop scandal, involving police infiltration of left-wing groups. Starmer, in a tremendous act of transparency and justice, refused to reveal how many historic cases were built by evidence obtained by spy cops. Relevant because convictions obtained using evidence acquired by spy cops were quashed, meaning Starmer ensured people who shouldn't have been in prison were languishing in it. Another case that contrasts with Keir Starmer's lax attitude to prosecuting certain types of people and his willingness to submit to where he believes power comes from is his treatment of Gary McKinnon. Gary McKinnon was a real-life hacker, only instead of looking shady in a hitman level, he believed the US government was hiding information about UFOs. I mean, I kind of believe that too, to some extent, but I don't hack the US systems to satisfy my curiosity. Mainly because I can't. In any case, America wanted to extradite him. He was by no means the only extradition Starmer tried to enforce, but this case had the most interesting twist at the end. The potential penalty for McKinnon was up to 70 years in prison, which would likely have amounted to the rest of his life. Starmer pledged to make sure that the extradition went through. I guess that wasn't the only pledge he'd failed to deliver on in his career. Starmer insisted on pursuing McKinnon. The case became an issue taken up by the press. Even the right-wing press thought that extraditing him would be inhumane. It got to the point that McKinnon became depressed and suicidal, thinking that he would spend the rest of his days in prison. Starmer, despite his record of opposing the death penalty, essentially held the power to either condemn him to a fate that was functionally identical or spare him. Particularly striking, and I think reflective of his fundamental cowardice when confronted by people impacted by his decisions, is this account from McKinnon's mother describing pleading her son's case to him. I couldn't understand it. Keir Starmer had written books on human rights. I had such faith and expected so much more of him as DPP. But when I made a point of speaking to him after the session, there was no trace of understanding. "I'm feeling very uncomfortable," said Mr. Starmer. "Speaking to you is making me feel very uncomfortable." Did he have any idea how that sounded to me when he was supporting the extradition of my son to some foreign hellhole? When I told the DPP of the mental torment Gary had been living in for a decade, he responded with the same stock phrases that officialdom used, that it had been through many courts and they had all agreed that extradition should take place. Theresa May, yes, that Theresa May of Go Home Vans fame, decided to block McKinnon's extradition on the grounds that it was likely if he was extradited that he would end his own life, and that his human rights would be violated. It speaks to just how determined Starmer was to suck up to power, that he allowed himself to be outflanked on basic humanity by Theresa May. His reaction to the extradition being blocked was to plead with the Americans to still be his friends. What a pathetic worm of a character, frankly. I'm so mad that I just moved my straw into the frame. I'm gonna just... To add to this spinelessness, Keir Starmer also used the classic not enough evidence trick to avoid prosecuting MI5 agents who were alleged to have been involved in the torture of Binyam Mohammed. This was a pattern that would repeat with an incident involving an Afghan terror suspect who was tortured. Not enough evidence, apparently. Starmer also delayed processing a private prosecution request related to the former Israeli Foreign Minister, Tzipi Livni, who was part of the Israeli war cabinet who led the country during its 2008 escalation of its ongoing genocide of Palestinian people. His purpose in delaying it seems to have been so that she could have been given immunity from prosecution, something it was within his gift to challenge, but that he declined to do. What character is painted by this collection of Keir Starmer's deeds? He's very keen for us to judge him by those and not his words. Let's do him that courtesy. The best case scenario is that he has good intentions, but the institution of the Crown Prosecution Service was just too big. It had too much of an ingrained culture, and it influenced him in return. As a part of the British state, it's reasonable to suggest that the institutional character is to allow the strong or the well-connected to do as they will, while the weak suffer what they must. And that is very much what Starmer's record looks like. Social and ethnic minorities are not given the same regard as those that often terrorize them. Even before his appointment as Director of Public Prosecutions, we saw this in his handling of the Thurl bonfires. If Keir Starmer wants to assert that his time as Director of Public Prosecutions demonstrates the character and leadership required to be Prime Minister of the UK, then I think that he must have a similarly low opinion as me about Britain. So much for all those flags he hangs out with, I guess. The character shown here is really a pathetic bully, bringing the force of the state upon vulnerable people, marginalized people, people who in the grand scheme of the context in which their crimes were committed were rather minor actors, while miraculously always managing to find that there isn't enough evidence to prosecute police officers or delays in acting on war criminals. His record as Director of Public Prosecutions is often boiled down to Jimmy Savile. And certainly, I think if he claims every success as his own, it's only right to scrutinise him for his failure to create an institution capable of prosecuting Jimmy Savile. There's actually so much more and so many worse things that he presided over. I didn't even get to talk about how rape prosecutions fell on his watch, or the Twitter joke trial where his behaviour was so suspect that Louise Mensch, yes, that Louise Mensch, called for there to be an investigation. I also didn't get to talk about how he led an organisation that was called institutionally homophobic, but we will be picking up on that thread a bit later on. At the 2015 general election, Keir Starmer was elected to Parliament as the member for Holborn and St Pancras, which is where we get to see how these experiences may have shaped the political instincts and how he conducted himself as a politician. The Prime Minister of the UK has quite extensive powers. True, they're only able to wield these powers if they're in office, and that requires the confidence of a majority in the Commons. It is rare, though, for a Prime Minister who commands a majority, or at least a single-party majority, to be ousted by their own MPs voting against them in a confidence vote. Primarily because doing so would mean that they lose the party whip. Nominally, the monarch wields the powers I'm attributing to the Prime Minister, but in practice and conventionally, they only do so with the Prime Minister's advice, because to not do so would be dicey for the monarchy, tends not to end very well, and we've already had an incident involving one King Charles. These include the power to declare war, which is why when David Cameron lost his vote to bomb Syria, he was subsequently asked whether he would heed Parliament's decision, because he could have ignored it. It may not have been wise, but it was in his gift. The Prime Minister also sets the direction of the government by appointing a cabinet and ideally leading them, although that's been lacking in recent years, I suppose. This matters for a couple of reasons. One, ministers can unilaterally change legislation using statutory instruments, though it's worth noting that statutory instruments are not often used for contentious issues, meaning that their instincts or the instincts of their leader could have wide-ranging impacts if legislation is changed recklessly, or indeed if they're the product of a toxic institutional environment in their party. 2. If the Prime Minister constructs a cabinet of yes-men, then their power and therefore the impact of their instincts is amplified, and very few Prime Ministers select habitual rebels to join their cabinet. There's a reason that up until very recently, resignations from cabinet were relatively rare. While Keir Starmer hasn't wielded any institutional power in the country at large as a politician, he did as Director of Public Prosecutions, and we've seen how that went. He has wielded it within his own party, and how he's chosen to do so and the forces within his party that he's chosen to align himself with are important things to consider. They will provide an insight into how he will run institutions with the backing of state power and violence. It will also be important to think about how he's chosen to present himself politically, and in what ways that's perhaps changed. Whether those changes are justifiable, or whether they demonstrate an untrustworthiness, a dishonesty, when combined with how he's conducted himself as leader of the opposition. There was a time when it was a regular joke to do an impression of Keir Starmer saying, "I welcome the government, but I encourage them to go further." And this came about due to a period of time during the early period of his leadership, particularly during the COVID pandemic, where the government would often engage in half measures. Whether or not you think that this rhetorical and political strategy was justified, it stuck. And an impression of Starmer emerged, which was that he struggled to articulate significant political differences with the Conservatives. His subsequent actions, once normal politics had resumed, did little to shake that impression. In Keir Starmer's very minor defense, if the government you're opposing is just doing what you want to do, sitting there and saying, "Okay, more," is an entirely valid political strategy. Lots of political parties have done it in the past. I think of like the Italian Communist Party. They did that with the Italian Christian Democrats. But they had this one thing, which was that they had a very different ultimate vision for where they wanted society to go. Can we say the same for Labour based on its time in opposition led by Keir Starmer? I want to focus on the Rwanda scheme. I explained it in the last video, but for those out of the loop, the Rwanda scheme is a plan to deport people to Rwanda if they try to enter the UK illegally. Whatever the fuck that means. Mostly in response to small boat crossings in the Channel, a problem that I have already offered a solution to, which is to offer them safe routes and process asylum claims in the UK. Of course, that solution is predicated on the idea that the boats are what's bothering people and not the fact that adverts sometimes have black people in them. There are a lot of things wrong with this plan, and a lot of ways you could attack it. It's unethical, it's incompatible with the UK's international obligations. Rwanda is not a safe third country. You know, the kind of things that a human being would be concerned about. Some Labour figures have made these kinds of arguments, but over and over again, what we've heard is that it's the cost that's outraging them. And that isn't to say that the cost of the Rwanda scheme is wholly irrelevant, but when it's the criticism you keep going to over and over and over again, while barely touching on the other ones, it's not exactly a criticism that emphasizes significant philosophical differences. In fact, and I've tried to make this as manifesto agnostic as possible, But Labour has decided its great solution is a border force command, which I regret to inform you will not solve the problem of small boats and goes hand in hand with their, at least at the time of recording, rumoured commitment to lower net migration. Once again, as I said in the last video about the Tories, it's not actually about the boats, but about running the racism factory more efficiently. Truly inspiring stuff. Another area where Keir Starmer's Labour Party is struggling is articulating exactly what it would do differently in fiscal policy. This sounds boring, but it's actually very important since Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, notably during his first debate with Rishi Sunak, have said that there will not be austerity under Labour. It's just that at the time of recording, I have no fucking clue how that could be the case. There are a couple of factors here. The first is that Keir Starmer has insisted on sticking to fiscal rules. Notably, these fiscal rules are functionally identical to the ones that the Tories have imposed on themselves. This has resulted in one of the few policy areas where they could have distinguished themselves. Green investment falling victim to it, and being another in what are basically a series of lies. Now, you can like or dislike fiscal rules, but one thing that they are is a political choice. While Labour claims it will do things like set up GB Energy, a company that, depending on what time of day you ask the Labour Party, it would variously be an investment vehicle, something that wouldn't generate electricity, one that would generate electricity but wouldn't be a retail seller, which I think raises more questions in itself. I'm just going to say what I think it is, which is that it's probably a private finance initiative style thing for wind turbines. But whatever it is, it will cost some money. At the time of recording, Labour's supposedly fully costed manifesto isn't out, but let me take you through these commitments that they've made. One, they will stick to the fiscal rules that limit borrowing, which is why the £28 billion target is more of a vibe these days. Two, they won't raise income tax or national insurance. In fact, at the time of recording, it seems like they've ruled out raising most of the major forms of taxation, which is a mixed bag of a decision, but I won't go into detail. And three, they won't continue austerity. That leaves quite a narrow path. Yeah, they've announced policies that will result in additional income, but within this framework, one of these three things has to either be bent or broken. Either Keir Starmer is afraid of being honest with the public, which doesn't bode tremendously for his time as Prime Minister, or he's lying to someone about something, which doesn't feel like a viable long-term political strategy if you're about to get the job where you have to do the things. Or, I guess as Keir Starmer would put it, you have to change the things that need changing. It speaks to the political ineptitude of the man that he's managed to perfectly trap himself because, contrary to the sound of his voice, he's not stupid. He knows that if he insists on being Mr. Rules, that he either has to raise taxes or some kind of revenue somewhere. Maybe he could do it on the rich, I don't know. But I find it more likely that cuts of some kind will be coming. And with the spending commitments they've already made, those are going to be pretty tough and actually pretty unpalatable to the British public. And more importantly, they'll continue the long-term underinvestment in the UK. Stagnation with Starmer, folks. We're going to love it. I promise we're going to love it. The consequences of this is that in constraining their political differences with the Tories, they've encouraged the Tories to push further right, and arguably they've now pushed so far and run out of road to the extent that they've just completely imploded. But for all of the "we need a competent government" types out there, a competent government to do what? Because with Starmer at the helm, and with his instinct, which is to be as close to orthodox Tory policy as possible, while also being extremely susceptible to press pressure, it seems like what you want is a government to competently do Tory policies, which you keep telling me are bad, and are so bad that we need to get the Tories out immediately. So why replace them with the guy who's encouraged them to become worse and worse so that he can then do their policies? You know, it's funny. Like, lots of left-wingers get called accelerationists, people who want right-wing parties to implement their policies so that revolutionary conditions occur. But as always, every accusation is a confession. Starmer is a prime example of centrist accelerationism, stepping out of the way to allow the Tories to wreak havoc and then duct taping all the pieces back together only to hand it back to them for them to smash it all over again. Sorry, I've spent too much time talking about policy. Let's get back to the personal stuff with a totally uncontroversial title card. It's safe to say that the issue of race and racism has had a way of rearing its head in British politics, despite the insistence by some that Britain is one of the least racist countries in the world, or that there is no institutional racism, and that we're not America, so any discussion of it is an attempt to import a discourse foreign to us, to which I'd say, who did America get its independence from, and under whom did the racial structure of the country develop? That's for a whole other video, though. Racism has gained a prominence as a political issue in the UK, and this has had consequences that I would suggest are mixed at best. One consequence has been the increased weaponization of racism as a political issue. This is where a common public perception that anti-Semitism is primarily an issue in the Labour Party and among other left-of-centre parties, while Islamophobia and anti-black racism and basically every other form of racism is an issue for the Tories and other right-of-centre political forces. In this video, I won't be getting into how valid this way of analysing racism in political parties is, but because the primary vehicle that ethnic minorities in the UK who participate in party politics participate through is the Labour Party, and its leading figures constantly claim that it is an anti-racist party, I think it's worth examining how Keir Starmer has contributed and how well he has conformed to this supposed tradition. Keir Starmer has avoided serious scrutiny on the issue of racism and the way in which he has contributed to an impression that he is either indifferent to or actively hostile to the interests of racial equality. I think that there is a body of evidence that points in a particular direction when he has encountered resistance to his actions or the actions of those around him or who are aligned to him politically. He's struggled. Some might say that for Keir Starmer, sorry is the hardest word. Early into his leadership, the Black Lives Matter movement had come into prominence in the UK in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. There were rallies, in fact there was a reasonably well-attended one in the city where I live and that I remember quite well, and people were looking at senior politicians carefully to gauge what their reaction would be to all of this. Keir Starmer fumbled. An opportunity to really stand with marginalised people against the forces that brutalised them, and he called Black Lives Matter a moment. Keir Starmer claimed that he'd misspoke, that the spirit of what he'd wanted to convey was that it was a defining moment, which, yes, would have come across rather differently to what he actually said. This contrasts pretty heavily with an aspect of Keir Starmer that supporters would like us to believe, that he's in command of the political message and knows how to deliver that message. For a guy who's supposed to be an excellent communicator, he sure does have to keep clarifying what he means all the time, which we will definitely have a few more examples of. Keir Starmer would go on to famously take the knee anyway while mired in the controversy, an act that came across as insincere and was a point of ridicule for others. I can't speak to how sincere or otherwise he was in this action. Perhaps he really did feel a need to physically demonstrate his solidarity with people opposing racism. I do find it challenging to believe that this was his only motivation behind this. Keir Starmer would go on to take a 3-hour unconscious bias course in order to put this to bed. Setting aside that this is the kind of thing that you would write as a joke about Keir Starmer, being the kind of middle manager who believes that this kind of trading is a silver bullet, I think that his decision to publicly announce that he was going to the trading exposes what this was for, which was publicity. I also think it misidentifies the problem, or what the problem was here. Unconscious bias training, at least hypothetically, intends to help someone overcome unconscious bias. Like, it's right there in the name. It can't solve conscious bias or acting in alignment with other people's conscious biases. I do think that there's a case to be made that Keir Starmer has a problem, and it's one that he's stubbornly deluding himself about. One area where I think Keir Starmer's troubles have been exposed, but also under-scrutinised, is the Forde Report. If you're British, I would not be surprised if you'd never heard of it. The media interest in it was underwhelming. I believe that's partially due to the conclusions that it reached. First, some important background. What is the Forde Report? I realise I'm going to be referring to at least two reports as the report at times, so just bear with me. Another report, called The Work of the Labour Party's Governance and Legal Unit in Relation to Anti-Semitism 2014 to 2019, was leaked by someone. It's never been confirmed who. The Labour Party believed it knew who was to blame, pursued them through the courts, spending more than £1 million, only to then drop the case against those individuals. This pursuit has included one of the funniest lines ever delivered when trying to assert that someone has done something. There is no smoking gun, which shows demonstrably and beyond any doubt that a particular individual was the source of the leak. Damn, I guess it's a shame that Labour wasn't led by one of the most senior lawyers in the country, otherwise they might have avoided such an embarrassing situation. This leaked report contained quite a few unsurprising revelations about the environment and conduct within the Labour Party by some, particularly those aligned with a particular political faction. It's a remarkably well-evidenced document that includes WhatsApp messages between staffers that they were able to use in this report because one of the staff members apparently used their work email to send the files containing the chats, which is a good time to mention, do not use your work email to send mycrimes.txt to other people. Your workplace probably owns your emails. The scope of the inquiry was to determine the truth, or otherwise, of the most significant allegations contained in the leaked report, as determined by the Forde panel. The background and circumstances against which the leaked report was commissioned, written and circulated, including how it was subsequently put into the public domain, and the structure, culture and practices of the Labour Party organisation, including the relationship between senior party staff and the elected leadership of the party. Before we continue, I just want to say that Martin Forde KC, as far as I'm aware, appears to not be an especially radical figure. He was, I think, pretty much handpicked by Starmer to do this. I don't think Starmer would pick someone unless he felt like he had a reasonable idea of what they would recommend and find. The panel took submissions from members, and in the report one of the key findings was that the evidence received pointed to a perception that some protected characteristics were regarded by the party more highly than others. Equally, this meant that some were less highly regarded. This was commonly described both in the report and colloquially as a hierarchy of racism, a belief that within the Labour Party, some forms of racism were seen as more serious, as problems, than others, and that this therefore contributed to a culture where concerns from certain groups were dismissed. Some might point to more recent events, particularly the deselection of Faiza Shaheen, as an example of this occurring. That it was such a common perception is not a surprise. Anyone who had been paying attention to the media, to which forms of racism the Labour Party had paid particular attention to, and frankly, the way certain MPs who had found their careers briefly delayed by Jeremy Corbyn being the leader, treated certain minority MPs who had been elevated in their place, would have understood this. That you can have some of the alleged behaviour, like Jess Phillips lying about telling Diane Abbott to fuck off, an anecdote that Diane Abbott herself has said is a lie, by the way, without any kind of reprimand or disciplinary process, speaks volumes about how out of control the party was. Why was this relevant to Starmer? Because his first choice for General Secretary of the party was pretty heavily mentioned in the report. She was unable to become Labour's General Secretary, in part because of the things the report contained about her, including that she expected staff to fabricate a case against people she doesn't like / her friends don't like, because of their political views. Which, you know, seems cool, and like that doesn't change how we should perceive certain events that occurred. Whether Starmer knew about this or not, the fact that he was so close to her that he was seriously considering putting her in charge of the day-to-day operation of the party speaks to incredibly bad judgment. The Forde Report returned a series of recommendations. The Labour Party claims to have implemented, I think, all but 2 of them, but it's worth noting that Martin Forde has been an occasional press presence, criticising Labour for how it's doing on these issues. Spoiler alert, it's poorly, including appearing on an Al Jazeera documentary called The Labour Files. Given the leaked report contained examples of pretty striking anti-black racism, specifically directed towards Diane Abbott, the UK's longest-serving black MP and the first black woman MP. In fact, the Forde Report describes the attitudes towards her as expressions of visceral disgust, drawing consciously or otherwise on racist tropes, and they bear little resemblance to the criticisms of white male MPs elsewhere in the messages. In that context, and the fact that Diane Abbott's treatment by Labour in the run-up to the election has been something of a news item, I think it's worth examining her treatment under Keir Starmer's Labour Party. I believe it's representative of what he thinks is acceptable political conduct, and how he thinks he can treat people who he has institutional power over. A lot of people like to say, whenever Keir Starmer's, I think, obvious issue with black people in the UK is brought up, is to say, well, he has David Lammy in his shadow cabinet, don't you think he'd bring it up? Or to suggest that his presence in a senior role somehow absolves him of these accusations. To which I'd say, David Lammy is his political ally, and it's actually much more instructive to look at how he treats people who aren't his ally. To give a good example, Diane Abbott. Diane Abbott was suspended from the Labour Party after the Observer had published a letter from her that downplayed the experiences of racism that certain groups faced. She more or less immediately apologised for it, but the Labour Party had to follow its independent process, as Keir Starmer loved to bleat on about. It was revealed that this disciplinary process had concluded in December 2023, and that Diane Abbott had completed the required parts of her sort of rehabilitation, as it were. She completed a course on anti-Semitism. Those of you with long memories will recall that it was revealed in March 2024 that a Tory donor was reported to have said that Diane Abbott should be shot. This timeline is important, because when Keir Starmer came to speak to her in Parliament, she apparently asked for him to return the Labour whip to her, which is, it's a Westminster nonsense way of saying to be readmitted to the party group in Parliament. But Keir Starmer just seemed to brush her off, saying, I understand, meaning that she was still sat as an independent when Parliament was dissolved. Now, this decision is important because being a member of a party group means that you get access to certain resources and all of these other things, and you can be supported more openly by your colleagues. When Parliament dissolved, there were real questions as to whether she would even be the candidate for Labour. This debacle spiralled into a week-long mess for Labour, which eventually resulted in Diane Abbott being confirmed as the candidate for Labour in her seat. But not before a whole lot of controversy had been generated. Her treatment was so bad that members of Parliament who weren't usually her political ally registered their discomfort. Keir Starmer repeatedly said that Labour needed to wait for the processes to run their course, when they had already concluded. He repeatedly lied to the press and the public about it, in my view, so that he could continue to withhold the whip from Diane Abbott as part of a campaign to bully her out of public life. Like all bullies, though, when he found someone who wouldn't let him get away with it, he folded. Diane Abbott is not a perfect politician. I do somewhat think she should have told Labour to fuck off, but that wasn't my decision. I can't make that decision on her behalf. She has to make the decision that's right for her. It's hard to look at the full body of how Diane Abbott was treated by Labour. Deliberately kept in limbo, not even allowed back in the party after the process had concluded, and a high-profile death threat had been revealed targeting her. For all of the independent process nonsense the whips, the part of the party process that kept her out of the party group, they report to the leader. He made that decision. And we have to consider what his callous disregard for one of the most senior black MPs in the country signals. Like, he was going around calling her a trailblazer. All of his lackeys in the shadow cabinet were going around calling her a trailblazer while they were trying to force her into retirement, a retirement that she might have taken if they hadn't have treated her like this. This is also unnecessarily cruel. One thing I will say before we move on is that minority communities in the UK can see how Labour treat their senior minority MPs. And as a warning to the Labour Party and to Labour supporters, you would be a fool to think that you will not eventually reap the whirlwind here. Especially when minority voters and people can just see how other parties treat their minority MPs and senior figures. Labour treat theirs like dirt, and they have routinely done so. Keir Starmer loves to present himself as your kind of typical centre-left politician. You know, he wants to present that he's cool with the LGBT stuff. He wants to go to Pride. He hangs out with people. He puts glitter on his face. And, look, to some extent, he's probably, on a personal level, probably, broadly, maybe fine, but also, like, definitely not. Because he's really fucked it with the T part of LGBTQ+. And we will circle back to that. In a lot of ways, he is completely unremarkable in that he just kind of conforms to the opinions of the dissenter of opinion on this issue. In other ways, though, there is a concerning tolerance for and blindness to anti-LGBTQ+ prejudice. One striking example occurred during his time as Director of Public Prosecutions, where the Crown Prosecution Service tried to prosecute someone for making twink... How do I put this? Twink content, where all of the performers were over the age of 18+, and all of the required paperwork to make this kind of content was done, and people in the Crown Prosecution Service kind of didn't want to bother continuing to prosecute it. Now there's this thing that happened, which is that the people who made this content were accused of possessing, again, I'm not sure how I put this, content that is Jimmy Savile adjacent. Now, I don't need to tell you that this kind of accusation is a well-worn homophobic trope that Starmer's CPS continue to try to prosecute, despite the fact that it was indisputably proven that everyone involved was over 18, led to the institution being accused of institutional homophobia, an accusation that I find credible. I do find it interesting, given who the institution had failed to prosecute, that they had tried so hard to prosecute a gay man for this sort of thing, even though there was no evidence that he had done anything like this. Keir Starmer displayed a pretty personal instance of blindness to issues facing the queer community when he went to Jesus House, a church whose senior pastor opposes LGBTQ+ rights, among a variety of other, what I would call interesting views. Now, you might be thinking, SK, how could he have possibly known about this? You know, like, how could Keir Starmer have possibly known about this? Like, aren't you being unreasonable? How's he meant to know what everyone in the world thinks? Well, for one, Theresa May went there in 2017 and got the exact same criticism, so jot that down. God, what a shame it is that Labour isn't led by someone who's detail-oriented, who might have noticed this like a lawyer. God, they could have avoided the appearance of endorsing a bigoted church if only they were led by a lawyer. Stephen Timms, a Labour MP, would go to the church a few days after Starmer's visit, despite Starmer's apology for going there, and he would praise Jesus House, an act that I can best describe as trolling the LGBTQ+ community. that the Labour Party saw fit not to punish, despite there being guidelines about homophobia, among various other things. No action appears to have been taken in this case, at least as far as I could see, and Stephen Timms isn't the only Labour MP who's gone out of their way to deliberately create, or at least try to create, a hostile environment for the queer community. In the UK, there has been a particular discourse around a particular minority group that has seemingly slowly taken over the minds of everyone. Non-Brits may and do often refer to Britain as Turf Island, and while I don't think that's an especially productive way of understanding the root causes of how this issue emerged in the UK, the political and media class certainly seem to fixate on trans people in a disproportionate and harmful way. I have my own hypotheses about how this may have manifested, perhaps a video for another time. But the UK does have a somewhat unique environment in some ways. Keir Starmer is not immune to being impacted by this. Transphobia has a home in virtually every part of the political spectrum and in every political party in the UK. Labour and the self-identified centre-left are no exception. One of the striking things about Keir Starmer on trans rights is just how much of a mixed bag he is if you take his time as leader, and just how dramatic a journey he's actually kind of been on. There were times, particularly at the start of his leadership, where his stances were more positive. They were never perfect, but different to what we would expect now. For example, when the Labour MP Rosie Duffield said that only women have a cervix, a factually inaccurate statement intended to be trans exclusionary, Keir Starmer initially said that she wasn't right about that, which is shocking if you know anything about him now. Of course, in classic Keir Starmer fashion, he changed his mind and said, biologically, she, of course, is right about that. And the sort of more painful aspect of this melting, if you will, is that it's still not satisfied the obsessive transphobes in the UK, because he said the other thing first. People can, like, this is the thing that frustrates me about Keir Starmer. He doesn't think people can go, like, Google and just look at dates and figure out when things happened. It's just, sorry, it's late. I'm getting frustrated. Back on course. This has been a general theme of Starmer's position. Mixed, but as time has gone on, it's become worse and worse. It's worth noting that during the 2020 leadership election, he was the only candidate not to sign on to the Labour campaign for trans rights pledges. An early sign, perhaps, that he was not to be trusted, even if he said the right things. He's combined this gradual slide into outright bigotry with housing, rehabilitating and protecting transphobe MPs. Of course, the particular example is Rosie Duffield, who has repeatedly escaped any kind of formal punishment from the Labour Party, despite her efforts to go out of her way to pick on the trans community. He's supported a ban on trans women competing in sports. He's regularly described women's and trans people's rights as if they're a zero-sum game and in opposition to each other, a completely false dichotomy that endangers the rights of both groups. His shadow cabinet, who we will get into in a little bit in this video, have also followed him in this direction, even when their previous positions have perhaps been more palatable to the trans community. Keir Starmer has also adopted positions on trans rights that compromise safeguarding, and will almost certainly, if implemented, lead to grave consequences, particularly for trans children. He said that he would support the outing of trans children to their parents without their consent, a decision that could leave children at the mercy of abusive, transphobic or homophobic parents. One that will, as I said, lead to grave consequences, especially in the current media and political environment. He also regularly does question and answer sessions with the notoriously transphobic forum Mumsnet, including one occasion where he suggested that children under 16 cannot make the decision to go on to puberty blockers. Incidentally, he has now supported the ban on people under 16 being given puberty blockers. This both implies that there is some kind of danger in the use of puberty blockers, which there is no substantial evidence that this is the case, and that he believes that under 16s cannot consent to medical procedures, without the knowledge and consent of their parents. This erodes something called the Gillick competence, described on the NHS website in this way. Children under the age of 16 can consent to their own treatment if they're believed to have enough intelligence, competence, and understanding to fully appreciate what's involved in their treatment. This is known as being Gillick competent. To give an example of where this might be relevant, if you had anti-vaxxer parents but wanted to get the COVID vaccine, this would allow you to do so without their knowledge and protect your health from their harmful beliefs. But Keir Starmer, because of his obvious kowtowing to transphobia, and frankly, I just think he hates children, to be honest, or at least trans children, he's eroding a well-worn medical competence, going against medical research, and potentially leaving the door open to putting millions of children at risk. Why? This man is not an LGBTQ+ ally, at least not one that his supporters would like to make him out to be. While the cowards at LGBT Labour will always fall in line because they're more Labour than anything else, despite the fact that they regularly have to condemn the things that he does. If you are a member of the queer community, if you're an ally to the queer community, it is your duty to say, as these protesters did in the wake of Brianna Ghey's death, fuck Keir Starmer. On that topic, some will point to his visceral reaction to Rishi Sunak's barb at him at Prime Minister's questions about knowing what a woman is when Brianna's mother was in Parliament. That sums up how much of a coward he really is. It's not the policies or the harm that he objects to, given that he constantly aligns with the policies that cause the harm. It's that the Tories were impolite about it, that they did it at the wrong time. That's what really got him mad. You can see him shake a little bit in the clip. He is a true coward in the liberal tradition. Fuck him. And fuck you if you're about to tell me he's the best option we have. One characteristic about Keir Starmer's leadership is that he sought to create a contrast between himself and his predecessor. I don't actually particularly hold that against him. He's entitled to make that political choice. But it has resulted in what I would call an instinct to constantly punch left, particularly at groups, policies, and causes closely associated with the left. This isn't new. The overwhelming impression that people in the political centre have is that the left is a fringe group who are disconnected from the electorate. That's why things like Unite not endorsing Labour's manifesto will likely be used as a selling point. It is interesting, in light of that the left is also commonly seen in centrist circles and in Starmer supporting circles as powerful enough to make Keir Starmer lose a 20-point lead. Almost as if there's an echo in here. However, this desire to distance himself has presented an issue for him. You see, in order to become Labour leader, he had to promise certain things, make solemn promises, pledges, if you will. At the time, a lot of these pledges, while they weren't necessarily like what I would do, they were substantially to the left of where he is now and were clearly targeted at the left of the party. That process of left punching, almost focusing more of his criticism on the Labour leadership that preceded him than on the Tory government that's actually in power, has apparently had the desired effect. From the looks of it, Keir Starmer can plausibly construct an election-winning coalition without the left and a large portion of Labour's traditional voters. And I mean the actual traditional voters, not the people who voted Tory apart from 97 and 2001. If a political leadership is constantly telling you to fuck off, or that you are fleas that they have shaken off, then perhaps we'll fuck off. If that's selfish or indulgent, then take it up with the guy screaming at people to fuck off. I want to keep this bit short because it's just so self-evident about Starmer, so it's not going to be a very long section on this bit. But Owen Jones has done a lot of videos, posts, and articles where he calls Keir Starmer dishonest, and for a while he also said this while saying he was still going to vote Labour. Mercifully, Owen has managed to come to a consistent position. My point in mentioning this is to say that the observation that Keir Starmer is a dishonest character is not a novel one. Even people who support Starmer acknowledge that he has the capacity to lie, whether it's Margaret Hodge saying that he lied to the Labour membership in order to get elected. Also, whenever you challenge a Starmer supporter online about his policies, or about the racism or the transphobia, just everything else that he tolerates, you're told that he's only doing it for the electorate, that it'll be fine once he gets power. He's only pretending, everyone. He's only pretending to be a horrible bigot. It's fine. Don't worry about it. There's a reason why, despite the fact that by the time this is out, it's entirely possible that Labour's manifesto will also have been released. That I've barely spent any time talking about Keir Starmer's stated political positions, and that's because what he says doesn't matter. He goes back on his word all the time. Calls Jeremy Corbyn a friend, pretends he never said that, makes 10 pledges, breaks every single one using bullshit excuses, claims there's an ongoing independent process about Diane Abbott, turns out the process had ended months before he'd said that. If the best you have to offer is, the known liar is lying to those other people, I may not be terribly inclined to trust him, even if he says things I agree with. Which Keir Starmer are we going to get when he's elected? Are we going to get the Jeremy Corbyn as a colleague and a friend Keir Starmer? Are we going to get the Keir Starmer who lets racist villagers off the hook? The one who lacks command of institutions? Or the one who changes institutions by his mere presence? All of this dishonesty was in service of one goal, which was to marginalise the left from political life. If you look at his dishonesty, every single time it starts from a position that is at least conciliatory to the left, and then morphs into a hard right position. Given that precisely 2 people have ever won office in a liberal democracy and then shifted leftwards, I think I'm right to be a little sceptical about what Keir Starmer says now, and what that means the reality is likely to be once he gets into office. And to be honest, it looks pretty worrying, but this is before the manifesto's out, so let's see how far right he can actually slide. The Labour Party at the local elections in 2024 had a pretty good night, except in areas with a significant Muslim population. Their vote share fell sharply in comparison to the other areas where they rose quite dramatically. One of the suggested causes for this was the Labour Party's position on Palestine. While their current position is much more palatable, the fact that it took him such a long time to get there speaks to a problem. A problem that I believe originates in a few places. 1, Keir Starmer is surrounded by people who uncritically support Israel. 2, the issue is viewed as a left-right political issue, and therefore his instinct is to side with the right. 3, Keir Starmer personally does not view Palestinian life as valuable in its own right. 4, that Keir Starmer perceives Palestinian liberation as a fringe issue that appeals to a community that he feels he can discard and still win an election without. Naturally, all of this is wrong or representative of bad instincts. These issues are what led to the infamous moment where Keir Starmer said that Israel had the right to cut off energy and water to civilians in Gaza. Members of his shadow cabinet actually went on to double down on that point, using the framing of Israel having a right to defend itself. But Keir Starmer would actually eventually go on to clarify that he misspoke. Good job no one's ever said that Keir Starmer's a slick media operator who's in command of the details of policy, otherwise they'd be looking very stupid right now. This isn't unexpected from Keir Starmer. It has been revealed by a member of the Knesset that he believes that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, a conflation that some would consider to be anti-Semitic in itself. He is regularly aligned with and promoted explicitly politically Zionist members of the Labour Party. In fact, one of his notorious high-quality candidates wore a shirt declaring himself a Zionist shitlord. We will be talking about him later, don't you worry. It's safe to say that Keir Starmer failed miserably in his approach to the latest escalations in Palestine. Aware that the Muslim community were furious with him, and it was hard for him to be unaware of it, he tried to find a mosque he could visit in order to try to diffuse tensions. He visited one in Cardiff and posted on Twitter about it, seeming to imply that the mosque in South Wales had some control over whether the hostages would be released. It's a very odd post to make, and it was incredibly unwise. I'm just going to put this out there, it was unwise. If that seems like an unkind interpretation, Bear in mind that there is no need to visit a mosque and say anything about the hostages. He could have visited quietly, listened to the concerns of the local Muslim community, and then just shut the fuck up and worked on improving his position. Instead, he chose to use it as an opportunity to absolve himself of his cowardly position. His position all along has been something along the lines of the law should be respected, while he's never budged from supporting Israel itself. If Joe Biden is Genocide Joe, then Labour's close tracking of his position should get them to be labelled the Genocide Party, and Keir Starmer is its leader. Fundamentally, that's what they supported, and frankly, they shouldn't be allowed to get away with it because of a few choreographed posts by senior figures on social media. The fact that Labour's front bench won't even put in the effort to make their own statements about the horror going on in Palestine speaks to how there's a pervasive culture under Keir Starmer's leadership that views Palestinian life as inherently less valuable, less worthy of the basic effort to convey your own feelings about the campaign of vengeance that Israel has prosecuted with the support of the British political establishment, including Starmer, who loves to hang out with the Israeli ambassador, a woman who thinks his own marriage should be illegal as she supports groups that oppose mixed marriages. I don't know if it speaks to his character, but if I were face to face with someone who thought my marriage shouldn't exist, I'd probably have to leave pretty quickly because there's some chance some kind of altercation would occur if I stayed there too long. That Starmer is such a sponge, such a worm, that he'd be seen dead with her purely as a victory lap over the left and Muslims in general disgusts me about him. Oh, how far he's come from his days being seen with banners calling for Israel to be kicked out of FIFA. Yet another place where Starmer has just gotten worse and worse with no prospect of him getting better. Some of you will be wondering, rightly, the party's position and his position has changed. Why make a big deal out of this? You got what you wanted. Why aren't you taking yes for an answer? First of all, I want to say that any shift is obviously an improvement, and I don't want to discourage people in general who are coming to better positions on the issue as they learn more. That being said, when Keir Starmer is Prime Minister, he will hold those prerogative powers we were talking about earlier. Events will happen over his time as Prime Minister. That's just sort of guaranteed. And what concerns me here is both the stubbornness with which he held to a position in the face of overwhelming evidence, and the fact that his initial instinct was not to restrain the UK's nuclear-armed rogue state ally, but to encourage them. It speaks very poorly of him that he was able to be tricked by the words of Nick Ferrari into supporting cutting off water and electricity into Gaza. That's the best case scenario. That the wording was awkward. Again, I thought this guy was meant to be like an excellent political communicator. You know, the greatest political communicator in British history. Not a guy fumbling over the term tech bro in Parliament and accidentally supporting war crimes. I also think his understanding of Palestine as solely a left-wing or solely an issue for the Muslim community contributes to this disconnection and completely avoidable fury that he's sort of encouraged from these sections. If Keir Starmer hadn't surrounded himself with supporters of apartheid, if he hadn't been so desperate to distinguish himself from his predecessor, he could perhaps have avoided all of this, and maybe the pressure he could have brought to bear on the Conservatives could have changed the UK's policies faster. We'll never know for sure, because Keir Starmer's political positioning, stubbornness, and frankly cowardice has denied us that chance. My personal thought is this: if someone demonstrates indifference to the suffering of people somewhere else, how far are they really from demonstrating that indifference, or indeed inflicting that suffering on people they see as similar in their own country? I'm not the British press. I won't insult you by saying I think Keir Starmer is an existential threat to Muslims in the UK. But if an existential threat were to emerge, I don't feel confident that he'd stand with them, or any other group under threat. He's a man who embodies the worst aspects of moderates. He can't be used for good, but he certainly will be used for evil. In British politics, since 2015, there has been an understanding that's been established, in part due to press convenience, and in part due to the fact that there is a little bit of truth in this idea, that leaders of political parties and other organizations are responsible for the environments within those organizations. The classic idiom was, a fish rots from the head down. That would be invoked over and over again. One of the outcomes of this was that it was agreed that party discipline within the Labour Party should be independent from leaders. Whether this is practical in a political party operating within a political system that is becoming more presidential, focused on personalities at the top, you know, I have my doubts, right? Regardless, that's what Keir Starmer insisted he's brought in for Labour, and so the results of that system are solely his responsibility. A fish, after all, rots from the head down, even if the head is detached as Starmer would like to pretend that it is. I want to remind us here of the case of Diane Abbott and her difficulties with the Labour Party, especially because in the context of those comments that were contained within the leaked report and analysed within the Forde Report, my belief is, and I don't think it's an unreasonable belief, that if Diane Abbott was a white person, she would not have had the experience she did with the Labour Party's disciplinary process. Either the time taken for the process to conclude or the withholding of the Labour whip, one which is supposedly independent from the leader and the other which is directly the responsibility of the leader. I believe it's also reasonable to suggest that had Diane Abbott been an ally of Keir Starmer or the Labour right figures propping him up, she would have had an easier time with the Labour Party's supposedly independent processes. I will get into the substance of that shortly, but I think that if you've paid any attention to the Labour Party's internal matters, and what a nerd you'd have to be to do that, this is pretty plainly a statement of fact. Another specific trend that has emerged is that it's clear that the Labour Party does not want to deal with the Islamophobia within its ranks. A short report into Islamophobia in the Labour Party, commissioned by the Labour Muslim Network, has quotes that show not only is the complaints process slow to conclude when the accused is from a minority group, but that Muslims in this case tend to have a long time for complaints to process at all. Some examples of comments include, my complaint has not been dealt with to this day despite being submitted a year ago. The complaints are still being investigated almost 1 year later. At times, the complaints procedure was very bureaucratic and monotonous. It took a long time before a response was given to the reports I had made, and eventually, no action was taken when I felt that action was justified. These were taken from a report early into Keir Starmer's leadership. While he may have inherited some institutional issues that he was unable to resolve by the time of the report's publication, there is a clear case that illustrates how unfit the Labour Party's processes are when it comes to perceived allies of the leadership under Starmer. Trevor Phillips was suspended from the Labour Party for comments that included saying that British Muslims constituted a nation within a nation, an accusation that clearly relies on Islamophobic tropes. He claimed that his suspension was politically motivated. I suppose you might say that Trevor Phillips believes that allegations of racism were exaggerated for political purposes. Whether or not that's the case, the comments themselves are clearly racist, and in a party that was taking this issue seriously, some kind of reprimand would likely have been in order, especially when you consider his large platform relative to lay members, given that he's a broadcaster, and those lay members could have been impacted by him using that platform to spread such views. One interesting view he expressed at the time of his suspension was that the truth is, if you do belong to a group, whether it's a church or a football club, you identify with a particular set of values and you stand for it, and frankly, you are judged by that. A standard of judgment that would, if applied to, just as an example, British Jews, I believe that Phillips would correctly understand that standard of judgment as anti-Semitic. The party, instead of reprimanding him, decided to readmit him as a full member, a man who believes that Muslims are a nation within a nation, that they ought to be judged collectively. Can we be surprised? In the context of a party whose sources routinely blame Muslims for electoral setbacks in the Batley and Spence by-election and in the West Midlands mayoral election, those are two great examples of when this has occurred. A Labour source blamed Muslims when they'd thought they'd lost. Now, of course, the irony is that they had gone on to win those contests. When they thought they were losing, they were very quick to blame Muslims. That's all I'm saying. It's not a secret that the Labour Party has been forced, whether justly or unjustly, whether proportionately or not, to confront the accusation that it has a specific problem with anti-Semitism. When Keir Starmer became leader, he pledged, as anyone would, to ensure that the Labour Party no longer had the problem to the extent that it was perceived to have. There's a few incidents where it's appeared that Starmer has jumped on these accusations in order to remove his political opponents. Obviously, the most notable is Jeremy Corbyn, but the one I want to focus on is Rebecca Long-Bailey, his former rival for the leadership. She was sacked from the shadow cabinet for retweeting an interview with the actress Maxine Peake, published in The Independent, which would suggest to me that he believes The Independent published anti-Semitic material, which is interesting because the interview is still up, and if she had said something anti-Semitic, I would question whether the decision to keep it up with no commentary aside from a denial from an Israeli official is wise on their part. The Independent also put up an editorial that is one of the most pathetic things I've ever seen, saying, Ms. Long-Bailey's error was in sharing what was a broadly positive message via social media without addressing the troubling comments that were also present. Keir Starmer's decision was not, as some of Ms. Long-Bailey's allies claim, an overreaction. Which I will say is an interesting way to refer to a reasonably high-profile politician sharing an interview on your website. I think this is more of an example of an outlet contorting itself to kowtow to a political leader that they want to stay on the good side of. There have been some people caught in the crossfire of all of this. The Labour Party, an organisation that Keir Starmer has referred to during this election as my changed Labour Party, has been accused of purging Jews from that changed Labour Party. Bearing in mind the earlier context, that Keir Starmer has been described by a member of the Knesset as believing that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, it will come as no surprise that this purge has largely fallen upon left-wing anti-Zionist Jews, particularly members of the group Jewish Voice for Labour. They made a submission to the EHRC, a public body that is responsible for the enforcement of equality laws. In that submission, they made the claim that Jewish members are 5 times more likely to be accused of anti-Semitism and that their members are 20 times more likely to be accused than non-Jewish members. I want to be clear that it is possible for someone to propagate racism against a group that they belong to. We can be victim and perpetrator. I do think that the fact that the Labour Party has very clearly taken a side in an ongoing dispute within a minority community in the UK has contributed significantly to these disproportionate figures. In my view, it's both extremely dangerous and incredibly unwise to wade into a communal dispute, no matter how overwhelming the numbers on one side may be. As a political party whose officials are largely not made up of members of that community, and where they are, those officials are not necessarily representative of all sides of that dispute, it just strikes me as unwise, as I said. If the Labour Party, just to give an example that would be relevant to me, took the position that supporting Kurdish liberation was anti-Turkish racism, and put British Turks through a disciplinary procedure based on accusations related to that, I would feel pretty uneasy about how that party and its leadership would behave in government towards my community. Even those members of the community they're ostensibly taking the side of. I think that any situation where you have such disproportionate rates of accusations of Jewish people of being anti-Semitic, that should probably make the leadership, the officials responsible, someone, whoever is responsible for this, to just pause, assess whether the process is fit for purpose, and review the substance of those accusations quickly and carefully. I know what you're thinking. Maybe this is just part of the new process. The accusations are taken more seriously, and investigation and then action is taken only with consideration of the substance of the facts and without consideration of people's characteristics or their factional allegiance. Wouldn't it be interesting if we had examples of people aligned with Keir Starmer, perhaps white people, who weren't forced to go through a disciplinary procedure that seems designed to humiliate the political opponents of Keir Starmer? Take the case of Barry Sherman, MP for Huddersfield, When two high-profile Jewish businessmen didn't receive peerages, he tweeted that there'd been a run on silver shekels, which I don't feel like I have to explain how inappropriate that is. Invoking anti-Semitic tropes in this way is something that is substantially more serious than what Rebecca Long Bailey is supposed to have done. Barry Shimon apologized, as he should have, though in his apology he mentioned that he had always been a Labour friend of Israel, which again is a conflation that should be more critically analysed. His apology was accepted by the party and no further action was taken. Now, Barry Shimon was a backbench MP who was approaching the end of his career, so maybe you could argue that the lenience was a one-off that was merited by the context. I will note that this lenience wasn't offered to others in extraordinary circumstances, and his really aren't extraordinary enough for me to buy that. Steve Reed is currently the Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He's been a frontbencher since Keir Starmer was elected leader. While he doesn't have one of the big jobs, it's undeniable that someone who's been in his shadow cabinet, who he trusts to hold frontbench positions, is much closer to his leadership than an elderly backbencher. When Steve Reed was Shadow Community Secretary, he described a Jewish Conservative Party donor as a puppet master, invoking a very old anti-Semitic trope. Steve Reed also quickly apologized and deleted the offending tweet, leading to a spokesperson for Keir Starmer himself saying, "Steve deleted the tweet and did not mean to cause any offense." We have to assume that he thinks a mere apology is enough, which is at odds with his own stated position that there should be zero tolerance. I know hypocrisy is often the weakest way to criticize someone, but it's also so obvious that it's remarkable that there's been very little press attention focused on it. I hate to play this game, but if this was Keir Starmer's predecessor, and it was clear that the processes were biased in favour of his factional allies, and he thought that an apology was sufficient for invoking an anti-Semitic trope, do we think that this would be unremarked upon, or do we think that this would be used as evidence that he was an existential threat to the Jewish community? I won't pretend that I think Keir Starmer is an existential threat to the Jewish community, because unlike the British press, I don't need to tell lies about senior politicians to make them look bad. I just need to look at the public record and tell the truth. Let's take a trip together to the parliamentary seat of Poplar and Limehouse, represented since 2019 by the UK's first hijab-wearing MP, Apsana Begum. She is, despite the best efforts of her local party and her national party, by the looks of it, the candidate at the next election. One of her opponents in that election is her ex-husband, running as an independent. You might be forgiven for thinking, well, this is just one of those quirky things that's happened, a fun coincidence. What does this have to do with Keir Starmer? First, let me describe the background so we understand that this isn't just some quirky little thing that's happened with a quote from an article about Apsana Begum. Between 2013 and 2015, Begum was in what she describes as an abusive marriage to fellow Labour activist Ehtisham Haq. After she escaped, Begum claims Haq still sought to control her, this time not by monitoring her finances or forbidding her to see friends, but by leveraging his influence in the Labour Party. Her ex-husband was close to senior Labour figures in the area that she represents, and there was a concerted attempt to remove her as MP while she was signed off sick, in part due to the way her ex-husband used the party to continue his abuse. This process was subject to many complaints, including complaints of vote rigging and intimidation. This is an MP who was sat on the Labour benches behind Keir Starmer. His party was used as a vehicle to continue spousal abuse, and local officials appear to have used it as an opportunity to remove her from being a candidate at the next election. Why did this happen? Apsana Begum herself has some thoughts. I'm being targeted by the Labour Party because I'm a socialist, because of my politics, because I'm a Muslim woman of Bangladeshi origin, and because I'm working class. They don't want us to represent people that are like us in Parliament. She puts the blame squarely at the feet of the leadership who were warned by a domestic violence expert that the trigger ballot process was an extension of this abuse. Think about this. Keir Starmer was told by an independent expert that the party processes were being used as an extension of spousal abuse, and they did nothing. This is a woman he not only has institutional power over, but in my opinion, a duty of care. No matter whether he agrees with her politics or not, imagine the moral vacuum you'd have to have within your soul to not at least intervene in the process to investigate what was happening in detail. There was even a final push, apparently, to deselect her again during Keir Starmer's last-second purging of candidates that he didn't like. Mercifully, this was unsuccessful, but there were some who weren't so lucky. If I told you to imagine a political leader who abused the powers afforded to the leadership of their party to remove their political opponents and replace them with allies at the next election, you would probably not think of Keir Starmer. But instead Boris Johnson, who expelled 21 MPs who voted in Parliament for measures that would prevent a no-deal Brexit. This was quite a shocking and dramatic moment in British politics, at a time when there were quite a few shocking and dramatic things that were happening. Keir Starmer has not had the cause nor really the need to do such a dramatic act. He's been content to pick off his political opponents one at a time. Not only that, but he's taken the opportunity to prevent figures who may be independently minded, or at least not quite aligned to his factional desires, from being candidates in seats that Labour are likely to win at this election. There are also allegations of voter fraud and vote rigging, but for now, let's talk about the administrative processes that are not being investigated by the police. I want to focus on a particular incident. Stroud is kind of your typical swing seat. It's not quite a bellwether, but it's one of those seats that both major parties have held, and in 2019 they had relatively similar levels of support. Labour naturally prioritised picking a candidate for the seat that, if it won, would likely point to them having a pretty decent night. The local council leader, Doina Cornell, who isn't even particularly identified with the left of the party as far as I could tell, a figure who led a coalition on the local council and who appears to have just been well liked across a full spectrum of the party and across pretty much all of the trade unions that could feasibly matter in a Labour selection. She was excluded from the Labour long list, which came as a shock to local members. It is the exclusion of Doina Cornell, a district councillor and leader of Stroud Council, which has come as a real shock to local Labour members. Cornell won endorsements from 7 trade unions locally, including Unite, the GMB, the CWU, and USDOR. This represented a pattern of popular figures being prevented from even making it onto a shortlist, often breaking the party's own rules about nominations, particularly those from trade union affiliates, assuring candidates of a place on the list. Instead, they went for the old trick of picking a local who may not be able to get a campaign up and running, and a hand-picked candidate. Fortunately, in Stroud, the hand-picked candidate, a former MEP and lobbyist, failed. While the Labour Party appears to have bent its own rules over and over again to suit the leadership in selections, and this is bad, I think it's fair to say, it speaks to an attitude that, if it's carried into government, has the potential to have some pretty nasty consequences. You might argue, doesn't a political leadership have a mandate to change the organisation in its image, including elected representatives? And I do think there's a logic there. But what do these actions speak to? Do they speak to a leadership acting in strength or in profound weakness? I think it's a sign of weakness, a sign that they know they can't really win by playing by the rules. And I'm not saying it's illogical to then do this, but it does look like the instinct has been indulged to a destructive end. And I have doubts about whether this desire to indulge will dissipate once they form the next government. There were a number of incidents that led to accusations that Keir Starmer was leading a purge of the left. When the snap election was called, Starmer appeared to abandon his cautious pick them off one by one method, because snap elections have a way of shortening timelines and focusing minds. In the case of Lloyd Russell Moyle, there was a complaint about his behaviour, and I want to be very clear and say I don't know whether what he's accused of is true or not. What I know is that he was told he wouldn't be the candidate at the next election for his seat, that his replacement was a man called Chris Ward, Keir Starmer's former chief of staff, and that he claims that this accusation is vexatious and politically motivated. I don't want to prejudge, but given the facts set out throughout this video, do I find it completely impossible that what Lloyd Russell Moyle says is true? No, I don't think it's impossible. But the reason why is because, given what we know about Labour's processes And given what we know about Starmer's past, can we really trust that this isn't a convenient excuse to get a former staffer into Parliament? The best case scenario, and I really mean this is really sincerely the best case scenario, is that it's opportunism. They saw an opportunity to install one of their own into a seat, and you might well think that someone had to replace the candidate and there wasn't really a long time for a democratic process. We'll be talking a little bit later about what the process looked like, because there's something quite interesting about it that maybe explains why a couple of very intriguing candidates are allowed to run for Labour when others aren't. There's one particular case that has captured a lot of press attention. Elijah Shaheen was the Labour candidate for Chingford and Woodford Green, the seat currently held by the quiet man and former Conservative leader Ian Duncan Smith. In 2019, she was a rare Labour candidate who got a swing towards her. In the context of an election where Labour generally lost ground, this was a remarkable performance, and while I think it's wrong to attribute too much of it to any single factor, the effort she and her activists put in surely counted somewhat. She was also rare in that she was a figure on the left of the party who was selected early on for a target seat. Often you would see people dispute the evidence of a purge or restrictions on left candidates by pointing to her. Whether they ever really intended to let her run at any point is immaterial. She was removed as a Labour candidate. Among the offences was a tweet where she was speaking out about her experiences of Islamophobia in the party. Another was a tweet that contained a Jon Stewart sketch, which amusingly led to Jon Stewart calling the decision to remove her as a candidate as, "This is the dumbest thing the UK has done since electing Boris Johnson. What the actual fuck?" This flimsy official pretext was not really hidden for long, as it was reported that people high up in Starmer's team believed that their systematic targeting of left-wing candidates, women of colour and Muslims was part of their electoral strategy to appeal to some specific parts of the electorate. Tell me if you can spot the issue in this summary of who they're appealing to with this strategy. These are the people, former Tories, swing voters, and yes, Jews, who the Starmer campaign needs to win over to get the biggest majority possible. For one, it's pretty stupid to just publicly admit that you're deliberately antagonizing your loyal base to appeal to specific groups. It just seems like admitting that will mean everyone sees through it and end up being annoyed with you. Worse than that, to suggest that they're pursuing a selection policy that appears to be in itself racist in order to appeal to British Jews is, I mean, wow. If it's not anti-Semitic, it's certainly not the way an anti-racist would think about racism and communal relations. Her replacement was Shama Tatler, a councillor in the London borough of Brent, not local to the area, and curiously, if you look at the register of interest for Brent Council, a member of the group called Labour to Win, an umbrella organisation for the hard right of the Labour Party. So, not just aligned to the leadership, but part of the organised wing who's helped him achieve all of these wonderful things as leader and create this environment. You would be forgiven for thinking she's just rewarding herself for a job well done, as she's a member of Labour's National Constitutional Committee who get to rule on disciplinary matters, and she apparently sat on the committee that decided Shaheen's case and directly benefited from that decision. That's very cool. Nothing going on there, I'm sure. One of the things I think is important to evaluate when we're trying to understand the politician is who they choose to associate themselves with and who they choose to distance themselves from. Keir Starmer has had a long time as leader of the opposition to make where he stands clear, and I want to look at the characters that he's surrounded himself with because there are some interesting clues as to what kind of political leader he really is buried in the details. I would understand if you're a little confused. After so much Keir Starmer related stuff, I'm just going to talk about people who aren't Keir Starmer for the rest of the script. Why? The answer is quite simple. When you're the Prime Minister, the people who you have around you are influential to the point that they might impact government policy. The officials, candidates, the people you bring back from the past to advise you, all these things have the potential to shape the future directions that the country will go in. To go back to the Boris Johnson example, if he hadn't removed those MPs from the Tory party, if he hadn't tried to make his mark on the selection process, might the Conservatives find themselves in a slightly stronger position than they are now? Might they even find themselves with a different party character? Who Keir Starmer has embraced in opposition and who he's ostracised tells us a little about his likely direction of travel. So yes, this is partly an excuse for me to do a guy safari, but also these are the people that Keir Starmer and the party that he's leading feels are equipped to represent their principles and how they'd want to conduct politics more generally. Keir Starmer loves to brag about how he's changed the Labour Party. Change, 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 change. It's all over all of their stuff. One of the biggest changes he got to make was who he had in charge of the party's day-to-day operations, a position called a General Secretary. Now, before you get visions of Stalin, the General Secretary is not usually meant to be a particularly political position as far as I could tell. You're the guy in charge of, like, resource management. Really, it's a strategy gamer's dream. This position is important, however. As you might imagine, being in charge of the day-to-day operations of one of the largest membership political parties in Western Europe means you have a lot on your plate, and you're directly responsible for any changes to the organization that the leader is obligated or desires to make. Which means that who he got in to handle those important decisions to create what Keir Starmer has called, and I will repeat it until it stops being quite so funny to me, my changed Labour Party, reflects on what his intentions were for his political project. Were they good? Were they bad? I guess we'll find out in a bit. Keir Starmer, particularly during the aforementioned Diane Abbott shit show, loved to talk about how Labour was fielding high-quality candidates. In fact, here he is himself talking about it.
I've said repeatedly over the last 2 years as we've selected our candidates that I want the highest quality candidates.
Which has naturally invited the question, how high is their quality? It sure would be embarrassing if Labour were fielding multiple extremely suspect candidates and are doing so despite things that were on the public record about them long before the election. So embarrassing. Let's take a look at Labour's General Secretary David Evans, Keir Starmer's second choice. Oh yeah, this guy apparently wasn't even the first choice. Do you remember that woman from the leaked report about how racist Labour staff were? Yeah, she was apparently ahead of him in the preference order. He was a Croydon councillor, a former Assistant General Secretary of the Labour Party under Tony Blair, and had a reputation as someone who would contribute in the back rooms towards Labour victories. As far as candidates go, he's not necessarily got the worst CV. I mean, if you ignore all the things that he said and did. Insofar as Tony Blair marginalised the left, he did so with the assistance of people like Evans. While he definitely has the experience in terms of the job description, he's also got experience in other things you may find useful if you're a Labour leader seeking confrontation with the left. It's only fair to assess his performance as General Secretary, and it turns out part of the job is giving speeches at the party conference. So let's see how his patter landed in 2021.
Everybody remembers why they joined Labour. What was it for you? For me, Jeremy Corbyn. Well,
safe to say that maybe wasn't what he was expecting. It's a good thing that no one said that the people around Keir Starmer would be effective communicators, because that would actually have been embarrassing. There was also an incident involving the Labour Youth Wing, whose conference is a required part of the party's own rules. It wasn't held, and in the process of what seems to be gradual marginalisation described in this Twitter thread, which included banning the Palestine Solidarity campaign from the conference, which, gee, I wonder if that would go on to look really horrible at some point in the future. He started a consultancy called The Campaign Company, which, well done for being the first ones to get that name. Like, how did no one else think of The Campaign Company? What did the company do? As far as I can tell, it occasionally helped people to try to win elections, which, given his previous roles and his wife's concurrent role when she was made the secretary of the company, involved in the specific part of the bureaucracy that deals with the rules for candidate selection in the Labour Party, it feels like something that maybe people should have taken a closer look at when they had the chance. Now, all of this predates Starmer by some time, but it's important background, and also none of this is really a secret. The company would eventually be contracted to provide services to Croydon Council for £200,000, though apparently when asked, people were hard-pressed to say what they actually did. Further important context, Croydon Council declared bankruptcy in 2020. Now, in fairness, its bailout was significantly larger than the money given to the campaign company, but I bet they wish they still had that money. Now, I'm not making a specific accusation. I'm sure the campaign company provided a very valuable service to the council. It's maybe a little shady that a council he has ties to provided him this contract for a nondescript service, but as Keir Starmer wishes he was cool enough to say, it's politics, baby. What are you gonna do? As the General Secretary of the party, David Evans is responsible for how the party conducts its internal affairs, which is why it's interesting that the Labour Party has so many accusations of voter fraud and is being investigated for it. The first instance of this involved the constituency of Croydon East, where Labour admitted a serious breach of personal information. This was after they'd had to cancel the selection in the seat where the use of a particular system was at the centre of the controversy. It is a non-voter that the Croydon East Labour Party was using to conduct the parliamentary candidate selection, and it is a non-voter which has been at the centre of growing complaints to political journalist Crick for more than a year. The interesting thing about the non-voter system is that when it's been in use, potential candidates associated with the left appear to have lost out, notably the MPs Sam Tarry and Beth Winter, who lost their selections. This could be chalked up to, hey, maybe their local members just didn't like them enough, and that's fair. It could be true. It's just that the non-voter system was made by Henson IT Services Limited. Who are they? They're an IT firm run by a husband and wife pair who also happen to be councillors aligned with the Labour right in Croydon, who were also given the contract to provide an online anonymised voting service for the Labour Party with no competitive tendering process. The fact that things have gone so badly in Croydon that the police are involved would make any competent head of an organisation perhaps consider investigating if there are discrepancies in the other selections that use this system. No chance of that happening, just business as usual in Keir Starmer's Labour Party. Let's turn towards some candidates. If Labour had better, more transparent democratic processes, it might well have avoided some of the more embarrassing people that have emerged. In favouring factional allies and in trying to shut out even mildly left-wing people, they've been forced to draw up a narrower group of people. That can have its advantages. Better, fewer, but better, after all. But these people aren't Leninists, at least not in the cool way you could be a Leninist. They have no real quality about them. They have nothing to offer other than a series of deeply offensive and awful personal conduct. That's a good note to turn to Darren Rodwell, leader of Barking Council and former candidate for the constituency of Barking. He was dropped as the candidate after he went onto a podcast and... well, okay, I think it's best to just go to the BBC reporting on this. Mr. Rodwell said he asked police not to respond if they were contacted by a resident he was planning to confront at their home. He also claimed he used official systems to find the address of the person who had threatened him online. Darren Rodwell said the incident in 2022 was prompted by the setting up of a Facebook page which aimed to have me taken out. Which is so many levels of things you probably shouldn't do that I'm kind of amazed he thought he should go onto a podcast to brag about it. Like, it's very mycrimes.txt of him, and I kind of admire the brass set you need to just do that. You might be saying, well, SK, look, that was a recent revelation. How could they have known he would be such a troublesome candidate? A video circulated in 2022 where he told a joke that maybe he shouldn't have during Black History Month. He said that he had the worst tan possible for a black man, which already isn't great until you consider that he followed it up with, but I have the passion and the rhythm of the African and the Caribbean. I used to do swing dance because I used to love jiggling about, which is kind of old school British insensitivity, which was reported to the Labour Party, so they definitely knew about it, and he claimed that this complaint and the commentary about it is part of the smear campaign. It's weird because I seem to recall that saying that kind of thing used to mean that you were definitely guilty of racism. Setting all of the substance aside, one of the selling points of Keir Starmer's leadership was that it would produce good optics for the Labour Party. Is it good optics to have a person who's talking like this as one of your rising stars? Like, genuinely, I'm genuinely asking you, do you think that's good? A rising star who's threatened to evict council tenants if their children don't inform on people who commit knife crime. I'm not one of those people who believes crime is out of control in the UK, but in the places where knife crime is a problem, my speculation is that they would not be keen to inform the police, or to even see the police anywhere near them. Making people homeless as a punishment for not speaking to the police is just an unspeakably stupid policy, an evil policy, but it's a policy in the Keir Starmer tradition, a policy that will disproportionately impact the poor, ethnic minorities, and brings the force of the British state onto them. No wonder he was a rising star. Oh, also he's hung his campaign banners on gravestones, so a class act through and through. Alright, so you might think, Labour messed up. It happens, and I agree, these things can happen. Sometimes circumstances just mean that you're unlucky. I find that hard to believe given how long Labour were aware of what Darren Rodwell had done, and how long he'd been the Labour candidate, but sure, let's just accept the premise there. If you wanted me to believe that, then you'd have to get his replacement to be, completely clean. Maybe not completely clean, but like at least someone who a simple Google search wouldn't turn up a potential controversy about. Because once is a mistake, and I believe in forgiveness. Twice is embarrassing. Wouldn't it be embarrassing if it turned out Darren Rodwell's replacement, Nesil Chalishkan, had some kind of well-known historic issue with her conduct? Come on, you know how this is going to go at this point. It turns out that former council leader Nesil Chalishkan had broken the code of conduct for a council and had engaged in behaviour that amounted to bullying. This was a ruling that was enforced after a failed appeal in 2019. It's also interesting to note that she called this a smear campaign and a witch hunt. How could someone with such a record be approved as a candidate for the Labour Party, a party that ostensibly should be opposed to workplace conduct that amounts to bullying? Well, here's a fun fact. The Labour National Executive Committee, its governing committee, has the power to impose and endorse, or not endorse, candidates for the general election. You'll never guess who's a member of the NEC. That's right, Nesil Chalishkan. Some might say that this resembles the end of an empire with officials carving up little fiefdoms for themselves. Others might say that the suspicious number of NEC members who have gone on to become candidates is a point that allows people to question the integrity of the Labour Party's processes. No candidate does more to make the integrity questionable than the guy we're about to talk about. I'm so excited. Like, I promise you, this is a guy. The Labour NEC has a section that is elected directly by the membership, and Luke Akehurst won the most first preference votes when he was elected to the NEC. He is in a lot of ways a true party man. He seems to love nothing more than working within the Byzantine structures of the party and mastering it. Hey, I get it. I like paradox games. There's something satisfying about understanding a system and being able to make it bend to your will. But me abolishing England in Crusader Kings 3 is not going to impact someone's life, potentially, whereas Akehurst has the ability to sit on a committee who pick and choose who's a candidate for one of the two major political parties in the UK. He has a surprisingly outsized influence. His political faction maintains a majority on Labour's governing NEC as a pro-Starmer bloc, and much like the governing arrangement of the UK, so long as you have a majority on the NEC, and as long as you're obeying the law, let's not get too carried away, you can more or less do what you want within the organisation. Who is this man who makes up a part of the Keir Starmer majority, who's helped him make what Keir Starmer calls my changed Labour Party? Well, for one, he's a rather odd man with very specific views. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se. I'm an odd person with very specific views. The electorate is full of weirdos. It's just that he's like the only person in the UK who thinks the Vietnam War should have continued indefinitely. Bear in mind that when he was announced as a candidate, he deleted a lot of tweets. So the fact that at the time of writing this was still up was surprising. I cannot emphasize enough how much of a fringe position this is in the UK. I've also seen that he thinks that the UK should have joined the Vietnam War, at least that's what people say he believes, which, given the number of films about how much of a shit show it was, makes me think he's the one person who's never heard the song Fortunate Son. Setting that aside, if you look at the now deleted purity test on his blog, which is an incredibly funny thing to have to say out loud, but it does exist, or at least did exist, there's just a lot going on here, but of particular interest is the fact that he thinks the Americans were the good guys in the Vietnam War, which means he might be the only person to genuinely misunderstand the moral structure of Star Wars to such an extent that I can imagine him being all "fuck them Ewoks" as a kid. For a person who accuses the left of being out of touch with public opinion, this is an extremely niche opinion to have. People would accuse Jeremy Corbyn of being an extremist when polls showed that the public agreed broadly with a lot of his political positions. Meanwhile, there's an actual extremist, someone with views that are held by like 37 people in the UK, and they're a Labour candidate, and they sit on the governing body of the Labour Party, a reflection of the character of the party's membership at this point, to be honest. Akehurst is also commonly lampooned as what I will call a nuke shagger. He loves nuclear weapons and the nuclear deterrent. And you might say, SK, that's normal, a lot of people in the UK support the nuclear deterrent. To which I'd say, oh, you don't know, do you? You don't know how he thinks this all works, right? I want to be clear. I don't believe in deterrence theory as it applies to nuclear weapons, or I don't believe it's a theory that will pan out in any good way. But the basic idea of it is, if anyone were to be foolish enough to consider using a nuclear weapon, the prospect of an escalatory response from other nuclear powers would be enough to stop you from doing it in the first place. It's the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun in terms of its structure. But, you know, that's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. If someone did use a nuclear weapon, the idea is that you would escalate to de-escalate. That is, you would respond with a larger strike to make them think twice about escalating to de-escalating in return. Which, as you might imagine, is... it's questionable. I'm not convinced. I'm unconvinced by it. I want to show you this thread on Twitter where Luke Akehurst suggests that you could use a nuclear weapon preemptively in an uninhabited area as a warning shot. If, by some horrible twists of fate, Akehurst was in a position to do this, he would likely have sealed the deaths of millions. I can't explain how far removed from like the basic understanding of how this is meant to work this is. If you're firing nuclear missiles preemptively, they're not for deterrence, they're an offensive weapon. This is a man Keir Starmer has parachuted into a safe seat by becoming an MP. It's not implausible that he might be in a position where he has the power to influence the UK's nuclear doctrine. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but there's like a non-zero chance that if Keir Starmer wins the election and Luke Akehurst wins his seat, we'll have successfully set off the chain of events that will actually end the world. That's mostly tongue-in-cheek, but it does feel a little bit too real once you spell it out. So let's get back to something that doesn't fill me with quite as much existential dread, but is still really awful and actually still does kind of fill me with existential dread. Luke Akehurst was the director of a lobbying group called We Believe in Israel, which is where I assume that very fetching Zionist shitlord shirt comes from. Now, I kind of can't believe this because literal lobbyist for Israel has outsized political influence and organizational influence in a major UK political party is the kind of scenario that seems laser focused to make people really angry in a post-Jeremy Corbyn leadership world. Regardless, the fact is that he is a lobbyist for Israel. He is a self-identified Zionist to the point that he's described the UN as anti-Semitic and defended saying so. Naturally, he's completely backed Israel in its latest escalation of its genocide in Palestine, including indulging in the debunked conspiracy theory that videos of Palestinians suffering the consequences of Israel's genocide were crisis actors. the kind of conspiracy theory that I think ought to result in your suspension from any right-thinking political organisation. But I guess Keir Starmer was just so wowed by him at those NEC meetings. He's such a personally charming guy, I imagine. He also believes that Israel should formally annex the illegally occupied Golan Heights, internationally recognised as territory of Syria. He's also suggested that Palestinians in the West Bank should accept the annexation of land illegally settled by Israeli settlers. A grotesque idea, a horrible idea. He's made his position on Israel's blatant genocidal intent and actions in the latest escalation clear. In a tweet on October 13th, 2023, he said, "I don't believe that anything Israel is doing is a breach of any of those points. It's proportional to achieving a legitimate military objective." In fairness, this is in line with the leader of the political party, who, as we will recall, said that Israel had the right to block water and electricity to civilians. Again, no matter how many times he claimed he misspoke, he did send his shadow cabinet lackeys out to double down before he said that. With all this, and given where we're about to go, I just want to confirm that at the time of recording, Luke Akehurst is not Jewish himself, so just bear that in mind when we get on to this next part. Just how racist is this guy? Well, he's obviously an Islamophobe, anti-Palestinian racism, and to be frank, this deep level of support for Zionism is often comorbid with it. However, wait till you hear this. He's also been accused of anti-Semitism. I will play the clip of him for your benefit.
Because they have abandoned very much of their Jewish identity. They don't go to shul at all. It's become a purely cultural thing around the occasional bowl of chicken soup or whatever.
Which is an outrageous thing to say, and he was rightly reported to the party by a Jewish councillor. And I just want to be clear that you can connect to whatever part of the relevant cultures that you want. I don't understand what he was getting at here, really. I don't understand what mindset you have to say something like this. Whether the Labour Party's zero-tolerance doctrine applies here or not will be of great interest to those of us who have seen how the Labour Party's disciplinary system works. I don't think anything's going to happen to him. This is far from his only racist comments on the public record. According to Novara Media, Akehurst also imputed an inner conflict to a black Jew who does not support Israel. Akehurst said Jackie Walker has mixed antecedents, Jewish on one side, Caribbean on the other. I could only interpret her remarks as somehow playing out some inner conflict. Which... yikes, this guy is a nasty piece of work. And you can see that in how his campaign for the seat of North Durham has unfolded. From the comical, which has him beefing with a children's party, and I can't say that and take it seriously, because it's true. But there's a more serious aspect of this, which is an alleged assault of a pro-Palestinian activist at his campaign launch, as well as someone who's apparently his wife, saying that pro-Palestine protesters belong in Iran. I know it's kind of amusing to suggest this guy is at the centre of violence. I mean, just look at him. He looks like Humpty Dumpty fucked a tomato. But my goodness, what a character. And this is someone Keir Starmer's Labour Party is basically protecting and endorsing. What does that say about him and the party he leads? In the UK, we operate under a system where the opposition leader, ostensibly in order to scrutinise the government, though I wonder how much of that is actually happening, appoints individuals to take on specific roles on their behalf. This is a political choice, and who they pick is assumed to reflect the person that they think, one, is capable of doing the role if they go into government, two, is a person who can effectively communicate party policy, and three, essentially agrees with the party's vision to the point that they won't rebel against them in any votes that matter. I think that the character of those he's closest to, and that he's elevated to being close to him, tells us a lot about where he wants both his party and the country at large to go. The composition of Starmer's shadow cabinet has been actually kind of remarkably stable, with a few exceptions. So we can assume that at least in terms of personnel, that the people he has in there now are signed onto his project. As time has gone on, he's promoted more right-wing members to senior positions while using every opportunity to oust left-wing members. He lost several members of his shadow cabinet from across factions in the Labour Party after they resigned over the party stance on a vote about the escalation in Gaza. Look, it's not a surprise, right? Right-wing man leading right-wing political project trusts right-wingers to do the heavy lifting for him. While this is never a generosity extended to the left whenever they're in charge of organizations, because then it's purity politics if we pick people we like, and it's protest and student politics and whatever else. It does make sense to do this, though. So let's look at a couple of key figures in his shadow cabinet, and one who's probably not making it past election day if all goes well, but tells us about how shallow the bench really is. Rachel Reeves is Keir Starmer's de facto deputy. While the Labour Party does have a deputy leader with their own specific democratic mandate, the truth is that they don't seem to be very close politically or personally. Starmer is very close with Reeves, and they seem to be coherent on their political and governing philosophy. It's a shame that the philosophy is, sorry kids, we don't have any money, but it is nonetheless a philosophy. Reeves is another politician who, like Starmer, screams boring technocrat, and that's not an entirely undeserved reputation. She is incredibly boring, and also sounds like a woman doing an impression of Keir Starmer. So, what could I find out about her? I've mentioned it throughout this video, but there was a major discourse in the UK for years about the Labour Party's anti-Semitism crisis, as it's commonly called. Reeves was seen as very much being on the side of the party that did not have this problem. Now, the existence of Luke Akehurst and at least one other member of Starmer's shadow cabinet should really make us question that perception and where it came from. But what if I told you that Rachel Reeves has written favourably about a Nazi sympathiser and attended the unveiling of their statue? Nancy Astor was the first woman elected to the House of Commons to then take her seat. Now, I would personally prefer to celebrate the first woman to win election to the Commons, even if she didn't take her seat, but she was an Irish Republican and a socialist, so I can see why maybe we're not putting up statues of her all over the UK. Like, I may disagree, but I understand. Nonetheless, if we recall the criticism of Rebecca Long-Bailey from The Independent all that time ago, about sharing a broadly positive message without addressing controversial aspects, well, Rachel Reeves seems to have never addressed the fact that the woman she constantly lionizes was a Nazi sympathizer. She was an anti-Semite and, of course, a vicious anti-communist. You might think that perhaps Reeves, who occasionally kind of acts like she's something of an amateur historian on the topic, just doesn't know about this aspect of her political legacy and political constitution. Now, I'm gonna be honest with you, I didn't really know who she was until a few years ago. It is the kind of thing you would have to go looking for if you were a layperson. However, according to an open letter by the group Judas, Rachel Reeves MP tweeted public praise for Nancy Astor with regards to the planned statue. Ms. Reeves refused to retract her tweets or apologise when confronted with Astor's anti-Semitism, in particular her claim that Hitler would have to do more than give a rough time to the killers of Christ before Britain should risk war. She can't claim ignorance, and this was almost certainly reported to the party at some point. I find it hard to believe that it wasn't. You might be saying, okay, so this is bad, right? But she was the first woman to take her seats in the Commons. Can't we separate the achievement from the achiever? Which you could, I suppose, in the same way that I could buy a vuvuzela and start playing it loudly in the middle of Market Square. You're free to do that, but people will look at you like you're a prick. I hate making this comparison, but do we sincerely believe that if Jeremy Corbyn, the bastard himself, had attended the unveiling of a statue of a person who was a Nazi sympathizer, that this wouldn't be a massive news story? You know it would be. I'm not even saying that she should necessarily be punished for it, but as far as I could tell, she's not really been critical of Nancy Astor's legacy at any point, certainly not in any specific way. To not even approach the criticism of her does give the impression that you don't think her views were particularly relevant to anything when she was an MP during World War II. Like, how is that not worth remarking upon? Even if she's a historically significant figure as a milestone for women's participation in politics, that doesn't mean you should whitewash her or endorse putting statues of her up. I feel like we just had this discussion about like slave owner statues and Confederate statues. It just drives me up the fucking wall sometimes. Rachel Reeves has also had a rather amusing thing happen to her. First of all, she routinely tells us that she will manage the economy properly. And while I know that an economy does not work like a household budget, the Labour Party does seem to broadly accept that framing under her leadership of the shadow finance team and with what their fiscal rules look like. So you might imagine that I found it very funny to find out that her House of Commons credit card had been suspended because she didn't pay an outstanding amount on it. So much for fiscal responsibility and rules. Look, Reeves is not really an interesting person beyond her seeming to be unable to find basic information about historical figures, plagiarizing her book. Don't worry, I'm not about to do a H-Bomber Sky style twist here. I just think it's funny she got caught. Let's look at someone else in the shadow cabinet, the McDonald's-obsessed, AI-generated NHS privatisation machine, Wes Streeting. He's the Shadow Health Secretary, an important job when you consider the state the NHS is in. And he's just the fucking worst. There's a reason why he's facing a strong independent challenger in his seat. More on that in another video. And it's because he's just awful. Like, he's not just bad in a typical bad politician way. He motivates you to want him to fail. Just the worst bootlicking, spineless prick that politics has produced in a long time. It's perhaps concerning then that he gets so many donations, a lot for a politician, and some of these are of course pretty standard and in line with the party that he is a member of, and you just might expect it for a politician of his stature. Now, I'm not saying that's right, and I'm not saying it's good that that system exists. I'm just pointing out that some of it is unremarkable. That being said, it does seem to be concerning that he took £175,000 from donors linked to private healthcare firms. Now, I would never suggest any kind of impropriety, but are we meant to believe that this is a mere sincere expression of their political enthusiasm for a man who somehow comes across as more robotic than Keir Starmer? Like, do businessmen just give their money away? I mean, if you're a businessman looking to give money away, I have a Patreon. But is that how they became rich? I don't know. I don't want to suggest anything other than they might know what Streeting's real intentions are for the NHS. He's also been one of many figures in the Labour Party to gradually shift his position on trans people. Originally, Streeting's position was much more palatable. Once upon a time, he would adopt a position that was broadly supportive. Now he says things like, "If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said trans men are men, trans women are women, some people are trans, get over it." And now he speaks about wanting to respect both sides, and Wes and anyone who believes this is possible. What are the beliefs of both sides? And are they both equally worth listening to? Like, just look at this shit that he's saying. I genuinely believe there is a way through this toxic conversation where trans people can live with dignity, respect, and inclusion, and women can have their sex-based rights protected. I feel optimistic and confident. I've said that earlier in the video, the rights of women and the rights of trans people are not in conflict. The undermining of one will undermine the other, but just think about this. He's saying that the positions, I would like to live in society as my authentic self, and these people must not be allowed to exist at all at any cost, are both positions we can respect. One of those is clearly a view we can dismiss out of hand. This is especially important because he is going to be Health Secretary if he wins his seat. Whether you think that it's right or not, health is the area in which a lot of the things that trans people need are provided to them. Do you trust this guy to actually do the right thing, reverse the absurd Tory impositions, and integrate trans healthcare into the NHS so it can actually function somewhat properly, and that we're not discriminating against a group of people? Oh no, wait. He welcomed the Tories banning puberty blockers. Get fucked, Wes. He's just a student politician of the worst kind, a grasping dickhead who'll sell anyone and anything out just to get ahead. He's found his patron in Starmer, but if I were him, I'd maybe look over my shoulder, because this guy definitely covets his position and is probably the heir apparent. Imagine it. Prime Minister Wes and Deputy Prime Minister Jess Phillips. I could already hear the centrists unironically loving it. My point is that there is no principle that he won't bend in favour of his ambition. He's only evolved on trans issues because of the signals from the leadership and because he's correctly assessed that doing so will get him some lovely friendly interviews in right-wing newspapers. I'd say it's going to be funny when he realises that these people aren't going to take yes for an answer and will only demand more and more extreme measures if it weren't so serious. For all the centrists who love to call any left-winger a student politician, this is what a student politician is actually like. Say what you want about the cringe types that you see at unis who maybe get a bit too passionate about things like stopping genocide or whatever, but they're at least trying to do something other than privatise the NHS and get to be Prime Minister. Labour's benches aren't that deep. There are a variety of factors that mean this is the case. I've even done a video about this as a broader problem in our politics, but no one exemplifies this more than the fact that Thangam Debbonaire is in the shadow cabinet. Now, she doesn't have one of the big jobs, but the fact that she's even there at all is astonishing, given how dogshit her political instincts are and how just poorly she comes across in every public appearance. For some context, she represents a constituency in Bristol and is running for the Bristol Central constituency. Bristol, like a lot of cities, is having what we might call a bit of a landlord issue. So it is a little concerning that when the idea of rent cancellations, which was the idea that during the pandemic we wouldn't make people pay rents, were brought up, she said it would be un-Labour to do so. Now, this is a remarkable admission. A rent moratorium would actually have been a really good policy to support people whose lives are in upheaval due to, you know, the whole thing that was happening at the time. She's right, though. It would be un-Labour because it would actually be good. So, you know, you can't say that she's dishonest. It's just that it's probably not a great strategy for a variety of reasons. For one, much like her colleague, she is facing a strong challenge. Though unlike her colleague, she is facing a challenge from the Green Party leader, Carla Denyer, who handled herself reasonably well in that debate she was on. How has she come under this pressure in a place like Bristol, a city that gives Labour huge majorities at general elections, and one where she did possess such a huge majority? Well, frankly, she's just kind of shit. A very typical member of the PLP, you know, a supporter of the legend himself, Owen 29 Inches Smith, and just well known for being kind of a dick about Jeremy Corbyn. Again, this isn't unusual for a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party, it's just that there are places with their own local dynamics, and Bristol is your sort of stereotypical place where the Greens would do well. You know, it's a core city, it's young, there's a lot of left-wing stuff going on. You can tell I enjoyed my trip the last time I went there. One very funny thing that happened is that a student tweeted, "Get in the sea" at her. Now, for those outside the UK, get in the sea is just kind of a way of telling people to fuck off. At least that's how I interpret it anyway. Now, if someone tells you to get in the sea, there's really a couple of responses if you're an MP. Either you ignore it because you're an adult who understands what's being said to you, or you interpret it as a death threat and cry in the national media about it. Guess what she did? I mean, it's laughable, but it feeds into a hysteria MPs have about their safety. Another thing I did a video about. Wow, there's a lot of shameless plugs in this, but I guess it's a very long video, so it's kind of probably the normal rate. Look, this is a ridiculous character who's not even going to be in the next parliament, at least hopefully not. Yes, it's funny that Labour's benches are so thin that he's had to turn to her. Does it say much about him personally? No, it was just fun. Look, we get to do... Look, it's a long video. I get to have, like, a bit where I do fun, alright? New Labour left behind many things for the UK. The long-term costs of PFI, a healthy scepticism of British politicians who want to wage war, and a bunch of people who believe that they're the most talented politicians of their generation and who can't just shut the fuck up and just can't stop opining about the active politicians who they think are just not as good. You do have the right, I think, to believe you do better at a job, right? Like, in that kind of armchair general, Monday morning quarterback kind of way. It's just that when I say I simply would have scored the penalty when I'm watching a football match, we understand that I'm never going to play professional football. Even if, like, a pundit says it, who's a retired footballer, like, it's also fine because they're not coming out of retirement to take the penalty, are they? Politics, though, does have a lot of places where things can happen. It's a big network of connections, and just the worst people in the world trying to win a war of position against each other. Long after your frontline political career is over, you can influence it from beyond your political grave. Like, a football manager can't take the penalty for his players, but you can definitely push your dog shit opinions onto people after you're done with frontline politics. If the press is good at bayoneting corpses, they're also excellent at communing with the politically dead to deliver their rare interventions to us all, the grateful public who just needed to hear what Tony Blair had to say. One of these new Labour poltergeists to be summoned by Keir Starmer was Peter Mandelson, considered a part of his reshaped team by 2023 and a core part of his network. Now, Mandelson was considered a key part of Tony Blair's team. He was a spin doctor, the guy who sorts out the press whenever they're getting out of line and tells them the things that they should actually be reporting. Think like Malcolm Tucker from The Thick of It, although he was based on Alistair Campbell more than Mandelson. Mandelson is one of those characters who just can't catch a break. He was forced by scandal to resign twice from the cabinet, and then there's this picture where he's hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein, third place in the 2019 Biggest Villain poll done in the UK behind Donald Trump and Jeremy Corbyn, though I suspect he's best known for other work. Given some of the questions around Starmer, we might question if it's especially wise for him to be hanging out with a friend of Jeffrey Epstein. It's not like this is some great secret, just Google Epstein Mandelson to learn more and all that. It seems like, even if he is a skilled political operator, which, you know, I could find believable, isn't there literally anyone who wasn't friends with Jeffrey Epstein available? Well, I don't know if he was friends with Epstein, but Tony Blair is someone Keir Starmer is very keen to be seen with. He attends the Future of Britain conference run by the Tony Blair Institute, which no, is not the name for his holding cell in The Hague, I checked. On some level, attending a conference hosted by a probable war criminal is probably one of the least offensive things Starmer's ever done. He is, after all, a former British Prime Minister, so maybe this is just him networking or hanging out with the boys or something. It's just that, according to Starmer himself, he talks to Tony Blair a lot. Part of that is about, you know, the experience of moving into government from opposition, and some might argue that thanks to Keir Starmer and his allies, there's a lot less Labour experience to draw on that, you know, that I would find palatable at least. The thing is that when you look at what Blair did with power, something I've done videos on at other times, you can only assume he was imparting his obsession with, like, ID cards or something. What's Blair been up to since leaving office? Mostly providing PR services to dictators, including the Kazakh leader Nursultan Nazarbayev. See, I bet you didn't think I'd say his name in this video. A man who was re-elected with a totally believable 96% of the vote. I mean, come on, man. Even Putin knows to tone it down just a little bit. Blair told him that the December 2011 deaths, tragic though they were, should not obscure the enormous progress that Kazakhstan has made. Which, you know, seems like the kind of association you should want to distance yourself from in the press. You don't need me to tell you about Blair in government. You know it, he knows it, Starmer knows it, because he actually opposed this stuff at the time. Blair's a war criminal. So why voluntarily associate with a war criminal, man? I do wonder what the appeal is, and given the stuff that we've spoken about, maybe it's the fact that Blair has said multiple times that the UK and the wider West should ally with Putin in order to combat radical Islam. Wonder if he stopped banging on that drum for any particular reason. Blair's journey has mirrored a lot of the political centre's journey, a gradual spiral into a pit of racism, supporting autocrats, and just being an awful guy. You can absolutely choose to draw upon experienced former politicians. I actually think there's too much of a tendency to discard politicians who still have something to offer once they've lost one of the top jobs. You do, however, get to choose. For example, yes, you could talk to Blair about what the transition from opposition to government is like. That's plausibly useful. It's just that when the only people you summon from the political grave are all right-wingers who regret not bashing the left hard enough, I have my doubts about whether it's really about drawing on experience and more about learning from mistakes and regrets they might have. Where does all of this leave us? Long-term viewers will know that I am reluctant to tell you what to do usually. I'm not in this case. The big question underlying all of this is, should Keir Starmer become Prime Minister? And while the electorate seem to have decided that he will be, the question of should is best answered with no. And that if you're a person who has a vote in the election, who has any kind of platform, anything at all, any way you can influence this. You have a duty to oppose him. Keir Starmer has allowed his party to become a home to virtually every kind of bigotry, every kind of ineptitude. His instincts are right-wing and are to capitulate to the right-wing. The mere suggestion of this kind of thing that has happened before, never mind something as evidenced as this video, was enough to justify blighting this country with 5 more years of Tory government. Thankfully, there is not much chance of that happening now. The Conservatives are well and truly cooked, even beyond what I said in the last video. But if this was a Conservative with this record, they would not only be considered unfit to be Prime Minister, but unfit to be in Parliament. For most of us, we can't do anything about him being in Parliament. But if you do live in Keir Starmer's constituency, Holborn and St Pancras, vote for the independent candidate Andrew Feinstein. For the rest of us, you might be saying, look, I like my Labour MP. They're a left-wing one. They do good work in the constituency. Do not fall for it. Your good left-wing Labour MP will vote to make Keir Starmer Prime Minister. Consider this. Every single vote, no matter which candidate it's for, no matter how reluctant, no matter if you shake your head in the polling booth so people know you disapprove, they will be taken as a mandate, an endorsement of the actions he took to become Prime Minister. If you don't want to reward Keir Starmer for the things that he's done in his career, both before and during his political career, and you don't want him to be Prime Minister because of those things, do not vote Labour. Who should you vote for instead? Well, I have some thoughts about that, and that'll be in the next video, but for now I have to say thanks for watching, and oh my god, I am glad this recording session is over. Just oh my god. I need to thank my proofreader, who's my partner. This was a long script, a beefy script, so well done to her for this one. I also need to thank Emma for making the thumbnail and for putting up with my extremely annoying vision for how these things have to look. I also need to extend a special thank you to several people in my Discord, without whom I could never have trawled this amount of information. I could never have put this together. I couldn't have done this without the people in my Discord, in my community. Thank you to every single one of you, no matter how much you contributed or didn't contribute. Just thank you so much. If you would like to join the Discord, there is a link, of course, in the description. I also need to thank the patrons, particularly the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersey Scheider, and John N. And I need to thank our YouTube members, Nadir Jiwa and Katie Marshall. Thank you to them as well. I will be taking a bit of time off after this, probably. Well, I say taking a bit of time off. I'm taking literally a day off. And then I'm back to the writing factory. So, you know, that's going to be fun. If you want to get the videos a day early, if you would like to vote on the topic of future videos, though for the election they're pretty set, but after that, if you would like to give me topic suggestions, if you want access to the super secret bits of the Discord, you should become a member or a patron and you will get those things. But for now, everyone, I need to go and cool off because, wow, that was a lot. So I will catch you all on the next one. Goodbye, take it easy. Don't vote Labour, and a special message for you all from Keir Starmer if you are left-wing.
Fuck off.